That's the reason why we're going to school through June the 25th. We had to make it up. We had to comply by making it on 180 days. With the exception of only 4 schools that we've addressed, all of our secondary schools easily make it on meet the rule on the 990 hours. It's our modified schedule at the elementary level that creates this challenge for us. Okay. We knew that because of this, we were going to have to make some tweaks to our elementary school schedule for next year so that we ensure that we're compliant with the requirement around time. At the same time, we talked about it in chairman's a number of times, and it was suggested that we might need to accelerate this work just to bring a proposal to the board for consideration, recognizing that there's some significant challenges for consideration with regard to implementation. I'll talk about those. So today, first of all, I recognize this is a very tight timeline. I feel it. I promise you I feel it. It's a very, very, very tight timeline. I do believe this is the solution to the issue of time. We will continue to, kind of, dabble around the margins of this issue until we are able to effectively address and commit to protection of planning time for our teachers at the elementary level. We're going to continue to fight the workload challenges until we're able to resolve this. So I do believe we have to take on and change our elementary schedules. Now, whether we do that this September or we do it the next year, I feel like we've got to do it. Okay? Now, I do acknowledge this is a very aggressive timeline, and we all have to be very mindful of that. So today we're really going to have an open conversation with you all about, the understanding of how aggressive this timeline is. Is it doable? Yes. Does it solve a lot of our major challenges? And it would recognize, and I'll let Dan go through it in just a minute with the details, it would also provide us an opportunity to, for the first time ever in the history of our school system, capture our requirements around elementary teacher planning time. Okay, and we've had a lot of good work done there, and you'll see that in just a minute. So we'll have to have, if this board at the end of this conversation today says we want you to move forward, we have to understand the tolerance of a very aggressive timeline, just number one. Secondly, and in light of everything else we have going on, I just think we have to be real about that. The second thing is, and the reason this is very, very important for you as a board to talk about, is it does require a allocation of resource. And we're going to talk through that today. And that's something that we all have to come to terms with. This is something that we can take on right now, given our financial constraints or not. And in short, and I think we do have, if we feel like we can't get there, we do have some options that in the short term maybe that we can do to provide some immediate relief for our teachers, particularly at the elementary level. And I think the differences are pretty significant. When you're an elementary teacher, in many cases our teachers have quite a number of preps. And that does make the work very different. And I can talk more about some of the options that we might have available to us should we decide that we can't do this because of the aggressive timeline or because of the resource allocation. So I do recommend that we do it. Can we do it by September? Yes. But I have to have a strong consensus from this board about both the accelerated and very aggressive timeline, but more importantly, it's the resource allocation that I really would want to hear from you all about. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead, and we have asked Dr. Pajara to kind of forego her presentation today if we need to do that at another time.
If I may, I think you seem to have addressed both working conditions from STEP's perspective on the working condition issues, and also giving a background on the why the STEP wanted to bring recommendation to a change in Fairfax County FCPS's master schedule. But that's since the second topic is working conditions, even with the it's just a limited amount of time. I would like to allow a board members, if you have something you want to ask right now before going into the master schedule. I truly believe the master schedule discussion will address many of the working condition issues. But if you want to ask any question on the working conditions, now you're welcome to. We'll do that for 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. And we did keep the presentation because we thought it's a great resource to you all, and certainly I know Dr. Pajardo can answer any questions.
Okay, I'm not forcing anyone to ask any question. If there is no one, we will go into master schedule discussion. Oh, yes, Mr. Strauss.
Okay, I just have, first of all, what is proposed, is this truly 180 days for students or 183?
Okay, we're going to get to that later, to the, on the working
Oh,
conditions
I'm
right
sorry,
now.
I thought
We're
we
not
were
gonna
going to
do
go
master
ahead.
schedule
All
right now.
I have specific questions
Okay,
on this.
if
No.
there isn't any other board member.
Let me
Yes.
elaborate on that. There are some calendar options that Dan will go into at
Okay,
the
so we need a
end,
presentation on that.
assuming we want to move forward with some change to the elementary master schedule. So he will definitely go into this.
Okay.
These, are the options that are presented,
Right, okay.
just shortly.
I'll hold my questions then.
Mr. Schurz.
Would it be more convenient for staff to interweave questions that come up about the working survey in conjunction with the calendar so that we can, because they're so intertwined, that I'm wondering if, as a result of the master calendar discussion, if we can't address some of the working conditions that could be
That was
alleviated.
exactly the point I was trying to make, that, superintendent and staff believe that discussion of master schedule change recommendations will address many of the working condition issues. So with that, we're gonna go into the, third topic for the day. And I have requested Mr. Paris to do the presentation in 45 minutes. 45 minutes, and as much as possible, unless you really have to ask clarifying questions, that we'll let Mr. Parrish finish the presentation in entirety before entertaining any question or discussion. Mr. Parrish.
One, I'd like to thank the board for dispelling any notion that I had about easing into retirement and enjoying your family and getting a more manageable pace over the last 6 months. But I do think this is exciting work and work that definitely needs to be done as I listen to our families and our employees around working conditions and what might be possible. So if we could bring the PowerPoint up. Yes. All the OKs. So as Dr. Garza referenced, initially what my task was to take a internal working group, take a look at our master schedule, which ultimately led to some calendar discussions, and come back with some recommendations to make to the superintendent this year about how we might increase our effectiveness and potentially find some efficiencies within the work. When we started to engage this, that included looking at elementary, middle, and high school. And there was a considerable body of work to look at that had already been done. So particularly even around the elementary schedule, this is something that SHAC has looked at in the past. We had an elementary group that had looked at it. We had a time for learning and teaching group that looked at it. So there was a body of work that had already been accomplished prior to entering into this task, which we did look at. And much of that work did come back and center around the elementary day, which is something, as my understanding, was launched back in the 70s, and has probably been something that's been on or in the conversation in this room for over a decade. So in forming that group, and I will acknowledge up front that had I known that I was actually going to be sitting in front of you all today to talk about this work, I probably would have gone about and done this differently. Because my perception was that I would get this internal group as not as an end of the conversation, but as the beginning of the conversation to sit down with a broader group of teachers, community stakeholders, and parents to look at these ideas to start the conversation. In the work of the internal group, we certainly had a lot of excitement about it. We felt like we had some good ideas. We did share those with Dr. Garza, and that resulted in coming forward to say, okay, in this discussion, could we come through and present our work as it stands right now? But again, to go back, I see this really as the beginning of the conversation rather than the end. So, the charge that was given to us, as I mentioned, was to look at our current practices across the 3 levels and to come back with some recommendations to Dr. Garza. Initially, I took this group and divided it up into 3 levels. There was an elementary level, there was a middle school level, and there was a high school level. Ultimately, at the end, the middle school and the high school saw so much similarity in the connections between what they were doing, they formed into one group, which was a secondary group, and the elementary group stayed intact as a group just consistent for that level. The objectives that we started with were twofold. One was to look at the belief system that's in the communicated well by the board, to look at our culture that we have about maintaining a collaborative process, make sure this is research and data driven, that it complied with state and federal requirements, and that it would look to the future based on our needs. And we also, the second piece, wanted to come back with something practical that we could present to say this is how we would suggest we begin thinking about how we might actually do it. So 2 pieces, one to be consistent with the philosophy and to create something that was practical. Might need a battery change. Okay. So the presentation I'm going to share with you is twofold. The first part is to look at master schedule and what you might do with master schedule, and if you're able to accomplish those changes, then what opportunities that open up for you relative to your annual calendar. So the first part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about master schedule, and the second part, I would talk about what might be possible within the annual calendar, which is related to the conversation you had earlier. So first, to kind of get into the heart of the matter, after we looked at this, our recommendations 1 is to make Monday a unified day for elementary school and eliminate the early close, which is 2.5 hours. One of the other pieces that we wanted to do was to provide 20 minutes of recess that was built into the regular elementary school day, which is a recommendation that had come out of a community group, and I think all would agree is a good target time for us to work within our schedules. And in order to do that, you have to solve the third bullet, which is provide additional resources and policy flexibility at the elementary level to increase teacher-directed planning time. So when I look at our working conditions and what we do with planning time across the 3 levels, when you look at this from a policy perspective and a practical perspective, there's a lot of differences between what's available at the elementary, the middle, and the high, and there's a lot of variances that occur from one school to the next within elementary schools. So we wanted to try to bring some consistency of expectation, policy, and practice at this area. So in order to do so, there are a couple steps that have to be taken. And the first one was to look at how we define the elementary school day. And when you talk about working conditions and digging into those, I think you actually have to first say, how is the work actually done? And in what we have in place now, does it accurately describe what teachers do and students do during the course of that day? So when you look at our bell schedules across the 3 levels, for the most part, this is how the school days are defined currently. The elementary day is roughly 400 minutes. The middle school day is 410 minutes, and the high school day is 405 minutes. When you take all the schools and you look at their start and end time, I will acknowledge that over the course of years, there's some differences in times, but for the most part, this is a good general working rule for the time that's available in the schools. And I did take a detailed look at 4 schools at each of the levels, and they all came out to this amount of time.
And I believe, in fact, that is varied on a year-to-year basis based upon transportation schedule.
Right, so it changes, and that is something I think that comes forward to the board, and bell schedules are approved at different times. So within the elementary school day, so part of this, when we looked at this work, is how it's defined and the demand that it's placed on teachers. So as a middle school principal, and I had some experience at the elementary school, I could see the differences, and I asked myself in this way. Let's say that your school dismissed at 2:50, and you were middle school. then I would ask myself, if you wanted to start a faculty meeting, when could you possibly, what was the earliest time you could possibly start a faculty meeting? And the answer to that question, after having a lot of experience, is probably 3 o'clock, and maybe everybody's there and ready to go by 3:05. If you were in elementary school and the day ends at 2:50, and I granted that they end later than that, but let's just, for comparison purposes, it ended at 2:50. If I ask you when you could start a faculty meeting where you would have your whole faculty there, the answer to that probably would be 3:20 or 3:25. And the reason for that is the way dismissal is done at the elementary day, is that the supervision responsibilities for teachers is much greater at the elementary level as you have a gradual lease of responsibility, and the teacher's supervision for kids stays continuous during that time, right? So when we look at the length of the time of the elementary school day, and many of our policies, particularly at the elementary level, define teacher time as time not with students and time with students. And then when you look to how the state defines it as part of the instructional day, the language in there is not exactly pure, but I think it's fair to say that the time that the teachers are with the kids extends into that time that occurs during dismissal, right? So this is pretty much looking at our practice. Let's just describe it the way that it really is, that I would argue that the elementary day is 410 minutes as it's currently defined based on the work that's actually done in there. Right? Because it has implications for if you define time for teachers within what occurs within the instructional day, and then you have time that sits outside of it. If you define the elementary day as when the bell rings to start dismissal, then you would think that teachers would have more time than they actually do, because it takes them 10 minutes or so to transition out. So in this work, we should build it into the schedule. All right, so mainly what I'm proposing here is just to define the instructional day for elementary schools as to the actual departure time for kids, which puts 10 additional minutes in the day. It doesn't actually change the way that teachers do the work. It's just more cognizant of how they actually do it at that level. In order to make this change, as Dr. Garza said, you're going to have to make up the delta, which is 2.5 hours on Monday that we currently dismiss kids, and what are we going to do with kids if we keep them in there during that time period. So I think there are a couple of factors that play into that time. You're going to need, and if in the course of this you need to create more teacher-directed time, which you do at the elementary level, you're going to need at least two different things. You're going to need some flexibility to use the resources that you already have to direct them to create teacher-directed time. And you're going to need an investment of some additional resources and staffing positions to help with that time period too, to find a balance in there. The four things I'm about to describe to you are practices that exist in some schools right now. They're just not in every school. And the realities of a school varies along a lot of factors. So if you're a smaller school, you may have less resources in your building than if you're a larger one. If you're a larger school, you may have a full-time band teacher or a strings teacher. There, you may have multiple counselors in your school, those kinds of things. So your feasibility of using this flexibility would be different depending on the profile of your school. There's some differences around resources if you're designated as Title I or not Title I. So it's hard to come up with one hard and fast thing that said as it would work in every single elementary school. But some of the flexibility that we're asking for is where feasible. So right now with our World Languages FLES program, that instruction is a pullout, which requires the classroom-based teacher in many instances to be in the classroom with the FLEX teacher. And so some schools have asked for the flexibility to have the FLES teacher take the kids on their own, which creates time for teachers for the core teacher. And this is consistent with some of the direction that you hear about in the future, that we might be able to capture that going forward. Right now with Triple T, what we call Triple T, which creates time for teachers, there are 3 elements that are in it, which are the general music program, art, and physical education. And then we have band, strings, and choral music, which is a pull program. So in some schools, if kids were so inclined, they can have 4 music experiences. They can have the general music and then the 3 outside of that. So when kids are pulled, they're pulled out of the base classroom, so it creates some challenges for the teacher to continue the core instruction that goes on, because some kids are in the classroom and some aren't. So with this, we're asking for some flexibility where appropriate or workable to include band, strings, and choral into the triple T time, if that were possible, but it's not going to be something that's going to be uniform at every school depending on your size. Where feasible, allows small base classes to be combined for triple T specials block. Right? For example, let's say that you have 7 sections of a particular grade level, 5th grade. Particularly if you're a Title I school, you might have very small class sizes. And then when they come out for the classes, if you had 7 of them, could you take one of the classes and divide them into the other 6 so that you only have 6 specials box, which still keeps a fairly small class size, but it'll create some efficiencies for you in that regard. And the fourth piece of flexibility that would be necessary to consider would be to focus the current instructional practices of available sport personnel that are already in the building and already being conducted within the building, to focus it to create some additional time for the collaborative process within the school. This particular bullet would require some additional engagement to make sure that you had the balance of that right. All right? But for example, counselors do lessons that they provide in the classroom now. Could you focus that to, and I'll show you a little bit later on our suggestion for how that might be done, to focus that time so that it created time for teachers in other areas. You also have assistant principals that do SR&R instruction, which is required. Could you push that into that block? You also have the media specialists, which currently in policy right now can do up to 10 hours during a week to provide time for teachers. And in some schools, you have your technology staff that's used to do that as well. But this is an area that would require further engagement to make sure that you had a well-understood balance to create that flexibility.
Dan, before you go on, I just
Okay.
want to remind, I think it's obvious, that we've had a lot of principal input into this, and so what you see is reflective of some of their best thinking. That last bullet, that would be very limited, so just before you get concerned about that, that would be very limited, and Dan would show you where that might be pertinent down the road. It would be limited. On the second bullet related to band, strings, choral music, we have the fourth, which is our gen music, our general music program. I've heard that from our principals since I came on board, that is we all love our fine arts programs, love them. But right now you could have students in at least 4 music experiences, and some of that's pulling them out. And so this is something that our principals said, could we limit that and maybe have 3, 2 or 3, or could choral or strings band replace the general music? So this is something our principals have been asking for a long, long time. So just wanted you to be aware that that's directly come from them.
Right, and I do think that's another bulleted area that would require some engagement to make sure that you had that balance right. I mean, I think we would all look at it and say these are rich programs, and if that was their area of passion, we would love to give it to them, but is there a balance between some other efficiencies and effectiveness that you could be found, and is 2 or 3 choices enough? I think those are conversations that are very pertinent for us to have.
And one final thing is it would look different at different schools. Just I'm re-emphasizing a point Dan made earlier. It would have to look different because size of school is a major factor. There's a lot more flexibility if you're a lot larger school, for an example.
Okay. So the fourth recommendation, I think, is the heart of the matter. When you look at our working conditions feedback and data that we receive, that elementary folks tend to rate their working conditions higher on 7 of the 8 constructs. The one that they don't is around time. All right? And when you look at that, I'll try to explain it as the best I understand it, and I'm relying both on my research into the topic and the fact that my wife's a 4th grade teacher and comes back and tells me this every day, so I have a decent sense of how this actually works. So in order to do something with the elementary day, you have to address the equity issue around teacher-directed planning time. And this is something that you have to do both in practice and something you have to do in policy. You also have the idea of collaborative time, which has been a key driver within our system, but our work with structured collaborative work and how that's accelerated Our policies in many cases predated the arrival of that expectation, so I'm not sure that we've accounted for them in all our school practices. So at the elementary level, if you have a policy that defines the time as time not with students, then there's a lot of things that could go into that that would be mixed around teacher-directed time. You would have collaborative time. You would have time outside of the regular instructional day. So all of these things create some inconsistencies across schools. So when we looked at kind of establishing a minimum guideline or target for collaboration, I haven't been a principal at 2 of the 3 levels and I haven't worked at a high school. I think, and I haven't been in the district a long time, I think these are reasonable current expectations around collaboration. At the elementary level, generally they do 1 or 2 blocks, and a lot of times it depends on the needs that you have within your school. So if you have kids with a lot of gaps, you're probably doing, more likely you're doing 2 collaborative sessions during a week. If you're a school that doesn't have those challenges, maybe that it's 1. If you're at the middle school where teaming kind of got its birth, you have 2 different functions. You have an interdisciplinary team function and you have a content-specific function like all the social studies teachers. So generally in those schools, those are 2 blocks of time during the week. And if you're at high school, because most of the high schools are in a block type configuration and every other day configuration, it's usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 of these block periods a week. Okay? When you average the time for those, the middle schools, which tend to, there are some variance in there, but they tend to have a everyday, 7-period, everyday kind of schedule. The time period for those periods is somewhere between 46 minutes and 52 minutes. The high schools, most of their blocks run somewhere between 90 and 95 minutes. So if you take this time and you looked at it at the middle school, which I'm most familiar with, if you pick the middle range at 48 minutes, most of the collaborative time at the secondary level is done in the IPR period. So you have a 7-period day, which you teach 7 periods. You have 1 that's at other administrative duty as assigned, which is your IPR period, and then you have 1 planning period time. Okay? So if I was at a middle school, I could count on having a 48, 46-minute block of time every day for my teacher-directed planning time. At the elementary, because they're not set up that way, it's not a period configuration, so it doesn't occur in that way. So in trying to work our way out, particularly with the elementary day, we wanted to establish kind of a target guideline for collaboration at 75 minutes per week over a 2-week cycle. And I'll explain the 2-week cycle. If you're in a high school, you're on a block every other day, right? So 1 week, you might meet 2 of your classes, and the next week you would meet 3. So it takes 2 weeks to hit through the whole cycle to equal it out. Many of the elementary days are in a similar type configuration that it takes 2 weeks to go through that whole cycle depending on what they do with specials, etc. Okay? So most of what you'll see in the recommendations talk about over a 2-week cycle to average it out. Second part of this is establish a minimum time guideline for teacher-directed planning to an average of 48 minutes per week within the standard instructional school day or 240 minutes per week over a 2-week rotation. Okay? Right now what the regulation says, because some of this you get caught up in the numbers part of it, is the regulation says that elementary teachers get 6.5 hours over a 2-week rotation of time not with students. So if it's defined time not with students, that's a pretty broad definition, okay? So that, if you figured it out as a single week, that's 3.25 hours in average in a single week, okay? So what we are proposing to do, and I'll show you how we propose to go about it, would be to account for 75 minutes of collaborative planning time during the week and provide within the instructional school day 240 minutes per week of teacher-directed time. That would be 8 hours over a 2-week period. So inside the school day, not accounting for things after that, you would have more time than is currently available now. Okay? This is the sample elementary schedule, and it's on a slide. If you get this, I'd print it out and put it on a bigger sheet, but I can walk you through it with some highlights. And what I did with this So this template that you're about to see that breaks it into 5-minute increments, it would be great if I could tell you that you just have to go to the SASE system and push a button and it prints out your master schedule. Well, it doesn't work that way. So one of the first things we had to do was kind of standardize a template, which I think actually creates some of our inconsistencies across schools because everyone shows their master schedule in a slightly different way. So we had to create a template that could show the work in an apples to apples kind of comparison. And this was the best that we could come up with right now, which takes the 410 minutes, because remember you're including at least the end transition time into the total elementary day. Most elementary schools have a roll-in as buses come in, breakfast, and they have a roll-out with dismissal. So we're only capturing one end of that for the 410 calculation. And what you'll see, and when we looked at this and created, I actually have 4 different schedule models. One is for a small non-Title I school. I have one that is a medium-sized Title I elementary school, one that is a medium-sized non-Title I, and one that is a big elementary school, which is the model that you have right here. 980 is a pretty good size elementary school, okay? So in this model, to talk about the guarantees that I walked through with you that you would have or that we would try to create, you would see that it has grades 6 through, or K through 6, and you would see in the teacher schedule that there is a 60-minute specials and CLT time that's built into the schedule every day, okay? When you look at this schedule to understand the elementary work, keep in mind this is one teacher's schedule for one day. And what I mean by that is many schools, if you have 980, you might not have a cafeteria big enough that you can send the entire 3rd grade down for lunch at the same time. So sometimes, and the way you serve kids in the lunch line, you need to kind of roll it in. So some of these things are segmented. And to allow that to happen, you have lunch, recess, and intervention time that is shown as a continuous block, which accounts for some of this incremental transitioning in and out. At the end of the day, kids get their intervention time, they get their lunch, and they get a contiguous 20 minutes of recess within it. Okay? When you look at the times that are available for the core subjects, they meet or exceed all the requirements that is put out there for by the state for accreditation. One of the benefits of going to a uniform Monday day is that these intact reading and math blocks sometimes get truncated on a shortened day, so you don't have an intact block of time with kids. You also have some differences that schools will built in. You'll see for this model at the 5th grade, there's actually additional time built in for science. That's because they have this science project at that level, so they're able to differentiate to provide some additional time. Okay, so I had one question up here around this CLT time and why is it different for kindergarten. So for specials for kindergarten, the requirements are a little bit less time. So in this school, the way that it works for them, they do use some of their IAs to offset specials time to create that block of time for their teacher corps to collaborate. So in our expectations, so the one question would be, how do you get to 240 minutes of teacher-directed time within the model over a 2-week rotation? So what we were proposing, remember when I said the flexibility around that we'd still need to do some more work around the media specialist, the counselors, your APs, creating a little additional time. So I'll use this as a block here in the 6th grade, that their CT time is 60 minutes every day, and they get that every day, every week. One time during the 2-week rotation, they would get an additional 30 minutes within their CT to be able to do 90 minutes during that block, which would be covered by the flexibility that I just talked about, okay? So that gives you a 30 extra minutes. You have 60 minutes every week and 30 extra minutes every other week, which that gets you to your 75 minutes of collaboration time to create equity across the levels. And if you want me to, later on I can come back and look at exactly how this works, but that's how it's created, okay? So again, to reinforce it, what you get is you get a guaranteed CLT specialist time at 60 minutes every day. One of those periods would be accounted for within your collaborative time during the week of the cycle. And every other week, you get an additional 30 minutes added on to that because sometimes the work in a little bit of extended block is very helpful.
Let me elaborate on that,
Yeah.
because I think I can describe it. I'm a third grade teacher. Okay. And I'm just using this as an example. 4 days a week, I would have 60 minutes, according to the schedule, 60 minutes of self-directed planning time, 4 days a week. The 5th day, I would be meeting with my CLT. The next week, instead of meeting with the CLT, that 4th day would become some campus-wide work, and it would be extended by another 30 minutes. Okay? So that means every week I would get the 4 days, not consecutively, this is just my example, 4 days of 4 periods of 60 minutes, 4 days a week, teacher directed. Okay? The 5th day would rotate. 1 week it would be with my team, the next week it would be more campus-wide work. Did I describe that well?
Yep.
Okay. Did that make sense, how that would work?
So in looking at this, and I wish we had more time for the engagement, and one of the things that would be necessary in a piece that I will create, and showing this to some folks, I said, okay, what about so I see the time for a core teacher, but show me the same schedule for a specialist so I can assure that they have their required teacher-directed planning time within it too. So we will create that. And I would just say that in looking at this, because you're going to have to make an additional investment to make this work out for all teachers within the system, right? That our expectation here is not that we're going to meet this delta by having specialists do more than what they're, I think most of them are working up to their maximal capacity now. So there is going to be an additional investment that I'll come back to about how you have to invest there, and I will go back and create a special schedule so you can look at it in conjunction with this one to know how it works. Okay?
Mr. Harris, you have
Yes, sir.
another 20 minutes to complete the presentation.
Yes, sir. So recommendation number 5 talks about the budget for elementary schedule change, because if you want to do this, there is an investment. Part of it can be taken up with some additional flexibility that you would have, but you're going to have to invest in it. So you're going to have to commit to investing in the staff positions at the elementary level to meet expectations for collaborative and teacher-directed planning time. There are different ways to meet that requirement. They would include increasing the investment in Triple T, like we've done in the which is already currently existing. You could change the way that you do world languages to make up that delta, or you could insert some other instructional programming into that spot to create the additional time. All right, I'll come back. I have estimated a couple different ways to do that, and then I need to be clear about how these estimates were done. Okay? So when I look at what I think the cost of this would be, that I would estimate the investment to be a minimum of $4 million to do it. And depending on your approach, it could be up to $7.6 million, okay? What I mean by that is that if you choose to invest and do it as just an investment in Triple T, it would cost one number. If you wanted to increase your world languages deployment or FLES to take up that time, which is already in your belief system and commitments, then that would be additional positions that would have to be pushed into it. So the cost of that would be a little bit more. It may be possible, depending on how you want to do this, to allow some blending across schools to choose different options that fit for them to do it. But in pricing this out, this is kind of where we're at with that. And the way this was done, so we had consistency around the schedule, is that I brought a subset of principals in and said, okay, if you had this much additional Triple T, could you produce this schedule with these tolerances in it? All right? Now, this was a limited group of principals, so if I had more time, I would have pulled the entire association in and said, this is what you're going to get. Tell me the unique parameters in your school. Could you do this? So with this subset of principals and what we had in our estimate, they all said, yes, we believe that we could do it, provided we had the other flexibility piece. The next slide I'm going to show you is one that you're going to see in a couple of weeks. And this was if you wanted to close this delta by an investment in world languages. Here's how this estimate would work out. So you're going to get more on this from IS moving forward. But one of the recommendations that they would put forward is to, right now, FLES delivers an additional language within the content. And the content can be any of the content areas that are currently in an elementary school. In this proposal, they would say target the content on science or STEAM instruction, so that what they would get in FLES would help to augment an area that we know that we need to strengthen. Okay? And to do it, you'd have to change some parameters. So right now, the staffing ratio for a FLES teacher is 1 to 450, and the classroom teacher has to, unless you've crafted some other agreement with your teachers, the classroom teacher has to be in the same classroom with the FLES teacher. It's a great program, but it's a heavy investment in staffing to do it in that way. If you increase the parameters around student-to-teacher ratios in your 46 FLES sites that you currently have, you would reduce the cost of operating those from $5.6 million to $3.7 million. So right now you're spending $5.6 million on the 43 FLES sites. If you wanted to bring up FLES in this model into the other schools that don't have it, right, that's 90, you have to expand to 93 additional sites. That would be a cost of $9.5 million. So to get to the number that I showed you, you'd have to take $9.5 million and subtract your cost savings from it, and that comes out to $7.6 million. Okay? So I guess what I would leave you here on this piece is you have some choices of how you want to do it, that it could be Triple T or investment in other programming aligned with what you wanted to do. Okay. Go ahead.
And on that note, we may have to, if you all say, this is important enough, let's move forward, we may have to be flexible on that based upon school need, right? They may say that they need to have a science lab teacher in a rotation or something like that, because I think it would be difficult to expand it to that point for next year.
Okay. So this begins part 2 of my 15 minutes remaining. So if you address the issues needed in the master schedule question by creating some equity of teacher-directed planning time across level and some consistency of expectation for collaboration, then it opens up some other options for the annual school calendar, which I think part of the tension points will be all the snow days we've had and what that's, magnified our focus on this. Here's a good trivia question for you around your dinner table. Having looked back at snow day usage from 1985 to 2014, you would see that we have used an average of 3.9 snow days per year in that equation. That said, if you look, and those snow days range from a one time of 0, which occurred in 1990, to 3 times that we've had 11. All right, that was 2014, 2010, 2003. People that remember 2010 would say it was way more snow days than 11. Well, the truth is we were so fortunate that it fell over the winter holiday, or that number would have probably been 20. All right? And when I look at averages, averages are averages. And if you take them over that extended period of time, I think our realities have changed. Within the last 11 to 12 years, I see more snow days being used. Part of that could be, if you're a global warming fan, it could be attributed to that. Part of it could be our changing dynamics. When I started in the county, when Phyllis and I started in the county, there were 72,000 students in Fairfax. Now we have 180 plus, and all the additional traffic, and I think all these things go into how many snow days you would use in your calculation. So we have I think we have a challenge around snow days. Okay. So to do this, our recommendation would be to switch from the 180-day option to the 990 hours for meeting the state accreditation requirements. All right. So the Document that specifies that is Regulations Establish Standards for Accrediting Public Schools in Virginia, 8 VAC 20-131. So I have commitment from Ann Westcott, who is the Assistant Superintendent for Policy from the state, that everything that's associated with the required time for the school day from the state perspective is included in this regulation. Okay? And the regulation says that it is 180 days is defined as their standard school year or 990 hours. So what we're proposing is to still continue to have 180 days in our standard schedule, but that if we start to encounter snow issues or other issues, hurricanes or whatever, that we would switch to the 990-hour way to meet that requirement. There's also a standard of quality requirement at the secondary level to have 140 hours of core instruction for those in the core subjects, which we would have to make sure that our internal parameters met those expectations. So when I looked at this about what I'm to show you and started to see what were the tolerances created by doing this, if you switched it over to a uniform elementary day, you would have a little more than 22 days at the middle school level banked above the 990 requirement. You would have a little more than 17 days banked at the high school level over the 990-hour requirement. And the reason that there's differences in there is because the high schools do an exam schedule, which puts them into early release earlier than middle schools. And you would create tolerances of 13 days at the elementary level. So what that means, if you'd had this schedule in place since 1985, you wouldn't have had to make up any snow days during that time equation. Okay? So I think that this schedule change does two things for you. It creates more time early on in a kid's career because the elementary day has more instructional time in it. It could be argued that at middle school and high school that you would lose some instructional time, but I think those can be made up by what we do inside the parameters we have right now, standardizing around passing time and those sort of things. And I think if you look at developed countries that outperform us on international tests like PISA, you will see that their teachers have more time to plan and prepare than we do. So I believe that if you invest in teacher-directed planning time, you'll have more rigorous and relevant lessons that will show up in the classroom, which will more than offset any changes that you would have. And if you take 3.9 days as the average snow day, I don't think the impact of doing this in terms of instructional time, I think you'll get way more benefit than you would deficiencies. Okay? And you'd have to adopt the new annual school calendar consistent with the requirements specified for 990 hours, which means we would have to standardize a little bit more about what happens in middle schools and high schools with those kinds of things, which I've already taken a look at, and we're more than capable of doing that. Okay? So, I brought two versions for your consideration. One is a version A, which has strategic planning days integrated into each quarter. And then I have a version B, which only has one difference, which has the strategic planning days front-loaded into the school calendar and provides one planning day on the Veterans Day observance. Okay? So I'm going to show you those calendars. And again, they're small, so if you printed a hard copy, you're going to be in better shape. Give me just a second to catch up with you. Okay, so let me point out a couple of things that are a benefit within the calendar. So over on this side, you have some little color boxes that tells you what happens during those days. And I will speak first to these here, these yellow boxes that are strategic planning days, okay? So in those strategic planning days, those are days for staff, and our recommendation is that 0.5 be for school-wide strategic planning efforts, and half of that day be for teacher-directed work time, which would be for everybody within the division. Right now, those days occur on the 14th of October, which has a benefit that if you're a community member, you're actually going to get a 4-day weekend there because you get Saturday, Sunday. Monday is already currently a holiday around Columbus Day, and then there'd be the teacher-directed, the strategic planning day on the 14th. You also have one on February 2nd, and you have one in this model on April 6th, which is Easter Monday, which is something that's been in the discussion quite a bit within the community. And you have a final day, May 4th, which is a pertinent time because schools are entering into their SOL period and finishing up their strategic planning efforts. So this spaces it out so you have one of these days within each of the quarters. Okay. I'm going to come back to this in version B in a minute. Okay. You also have these green boxes which show early releases or recommendations for early releases. Some of these are already currently in existence in our schedule, and some of these are new. One that is new would be the 31st, which would be on Halloween, that if you're in elementary school getting kids home before it's dark starts, et cetera, depending on how you feel about Halloween, that's a pretty good advantage if you're a family that chooses to celebrate that holiday. You have this one on the 26th, which leads you in, which is something we currently have already. It's not something new. You have one before the winter holiday, which is something that would be new. And in our model for the winter holiday, so my wife has researched this to some length, and she would say the best model is when you get 2 weeks off for the winter holiday, but that only occurs once every 7 years. All right? In this model, because of the tolerances that are built into it, you could guarantee 2 weeks off for the winter break in every year. You have a 2-hour delay that leads you into your January time period, which butts up to two. You have a work day, and then we placed a strategic planning day after that. So again, that creates some opportunities for families and kind of eases tension in the middle of the year for the school system, because that's a busy time as well. There you go, Groundhog Day. You have one in April prior to the teacher-directed workday. And then you have one here on the 19th, and I will say, I don't know how it was created, but we have had this 2-hour day at the end of the year, the last day, and this one would not be a 2-hour day. It would be a 2-hour early release day, but we would capture this as a full instructional day's worth of effort. Okay, you have in here some teacher work days, which we have one in the opening week. So the opening week doesn't have many tolerances that are different than it currently does. You have another one that is put into November 3rd, and you have a final one that's April 17th. These would be days that would be directed by instructional services to deliver instructor professional development. All right, let's see what I've forgotten in here. I think I have covered all the wonderful things in there. And what would happen if you adjust this schedule, remember, you would have to go 13 snow days before you would have to make up, your tolerances would be such that you would be required to make up the time.
Dan, if I could elaborate just real quickly.
Yep.
You've done a good job of explaining this. I think the benefit is, should we feel like we're able to do this, is the fact that we will have dedicated teacher planning time built within the school week that was described earlier, a commitment of planning time that's self-directed that we've never had before. On top of that, we would actually have throughout the year 4 days of strategic planning where we could focus the efforts of the entire system for half a day, and the other half a day, which would be teacher directed. So there would be opportunity throughout the year to, depending upon what we determine in strategic planning would be the division-wide emphasis, we would have time throughout the year to work on that. And right now, we've not had that opportunity built into the calendar. So I think both those things are, I think, real important.
Absolutely. Okay. Trying to meet my time goal because I think I get some kind of reward if I finish at 5:15. This is version B, which only has one difference, which took the strategic planning day that was previously on May 4th and moves it to Veterans Day on the 11th. So there's folks that feel strongly about that. So you have people that are kind of on both sides of that issue. So that's the only difference between version A and version B. Okay. So when we look at the estimated, there are some estimated cost savings if you were to adopt this model that could be captured. So annually, we budget about 18 million for substitute costs, and these are separate from professional development. So these are around personal leave and sick leave. And if you balance that out, it's about 100,000 per day. The fuel cost for a bus is budgeted at about, for buses is budgeted at about 9 million, which works out to about 50,000. Okay? So I applied just those minimal estimates of savings, and there may be others out there to be captured, that if you applied it to the current year, you would have saved about 750,000. And people would say, well, if it's 150,000 a day, how come it's only 750 when we had 11 days? But remember, by state code, there's certain days you don't have to make up. So that's why that number is a little bit counterintuitive. But I would say a minimal, if you applied this to any given year from the trajectory of the last 30 years, any day that you wouldn't have had to make up, you could have estimated that cost savings at 150,000 minimal. And there may be something with additional support groups, because we had some discussion around the board. So right now, if you're a bus driver and it's a day that you're going to get paid for every day, even if you don't make it up. If you're a food service worker, if you don't work it, you don't get paid. So there may be possibilities in here there may be some other efficiencies or things that we could do to offset those, but that'd be a further discussion. Okay, so after you look at that, what would be necessary, and I think these are really important to go deep to understand them if you wanted to launch such a thing, whether you did it in September or you did it the following year. And in my mind, these are things that would have to be worked out in a sequential order in order to do this effectively. The first one is I think you need further engagement from teachers, parents, and the community stakeholders to further review and refine their proposal. And one of the cool things that my kids did was around the all-county music programs that currently are scheduled on Monday afternoons. So if you change the way of that, you need to engage with those folks to figure out a way that you could retain those programs and how it would fit in. That's not a discussion that we've had yet, but we would need to have it. Second thing would need to happen is staff would need to recommend a viable program option or options so that we can go deeper into the costing of this, that this is how we would recommend filling up that delta of 2.5 hours on Monday. Remember, that could be Triple T, could be investment in world languages or other programming, or some combination of the three. Once we get that option, finance would have to take it and go a deeper nosedive to say, to further refine the costing to make sure that we were right on point with what we would estimate it to be out. The fourth thing would have to happen is human resources would need to facilitate the update of the regulations to both show that these changes and guarantees around teacher-directed time were reflected in regulation. Five, the school board would have to commit the funding needed to support the recommended changes. That was, we touched on that from the beginning. And principals would need support in adjusting and planning for the proposed changes around their master scheduling. We'd also have to take our executive principals, which are part of our new alignment structure, to make sure that these master schedules deployed the time that was committed in an equitable, consistent manner across all elementary schools, meaning that we would review all the master schedules to make sure that it had the tolerances in it that I described. That can be communicated in one slide, but it's there's a lot of very important and difficult and needed work for each of those steps. So that's where we're at. That's what's in the proposal. And I thought that I was going to be delivering this to Dr. Garza in the confines of her office, but I'm glad that I could spend it with you.
And then finally, I would just say, I think it's obvious that time is of the essence if this is something that we want to accomplish for next year. So we would not have the luxury of setting this all summer long. This is something that if we want to accomplish this coming year, we're going to have to get busy and need to get it done. So.
Okay, what I'm going to do is this. I believe that with topic with this kind of importance, everybody will probably want to ask questions and say something about it. I am going to ask board members for the time being, for right now, ask questions, and then we'll have a discussion later after all the questions are answered first. Okay, with that, I have a question,
Okay?
Mr. Paris. That when you said banking 13 days, or can have up to 13 snow days, does that count? I mean, because after a certain point, we only need to make up 1 day for every 2 days of snow days
So when
under state code. I'm trying to understand how many snow days, up to how many snow
Okay.
days we can have without
you just tell me when your question's done.
without
Okay, when I
without
said,
having to make up.
I know that I have my own language sometime when I say banking snow days or days. What I mean by that is if you take the tolerances, which I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of folks about that, the way that works, is in the state code, it says that your instructional day is defined by your start and end time, and then you would subtract time from meals, which would be the secondary component, and you subtract time from meals and recess at the elementary. So when you take those those are as they're defined by the state, and you apply it to this calendar and see how many additional hours are generated, then you divide the number of hours that exist in your day that you've established, right? So it definitely has more time than 5.5 hours. It's like 6 plus, all right? Then you divide that hours into how many additional hours, it tells you exactly how many days of tolerance that you have.
Okay.
The elementary is the easiest. Get me started on this. I like
Okay,
this stuff.
let me
It's
say this a
13
different
days.
way. Let me say this a different way. The requirement is either 990 hours or 180 days, either or. And we've got legal verification of all of that. So what we would be suggesting if we did this is we would no longer be going by the 180-day calendar. So that means we have enough hours beyond the 990 hours required, the equivalent of 13 days. So let's say we had a terrible, we had another snowmageddon, and we missed 14 days of school. When after that 13th day, we would no longer meet the 990-hour requirement. And so that's why we would have to make up. Did that explain
So
it,
we
Mr.
have
Moon?
up to 13 days of snow days without
Beyond the
having to add up.
990.
I'll give you the math. So if you took this and applied it to the elementary schedule that I just showed you, you would create 1,068 hours.
Okay.
The state requires 990. You take 990 from 1,068, it gives you 78. You divide it by an elementary day of 6 hours.
That's 13
because
days.
it gives you 13 days.
Okay.
After taking out recess and meals.
Okay, thank you. I have Mrs. Strauss, Mrs. Schurz, Ms. Hines, and Mrs. Reed.
Okay, a couple of questions. So this creates a uniform 6.5-hour day, correct?
Well, the elementary day,
The elementary day.
after you take out the time for the 20 minutes for recess and the meals, it equates to 6 hours.
6 hours, yes.
The way that the
Wait.
state,
So it equates to
Calculates.
6 hours of instructional time.
the way the state
Right.
calculates it.
Right, that was what I was, so it's a uniform 6.5-hour day for transportation.
Right. So
Right.
your secondary day is 6.5 hours
Right.
because you don't, or, 6 and a little bit because you don't have
Right,
recess.
Right, so it creates Monday would have the same schedule as Tuesday through Friday.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, okay, but you do have, you have schedules that would look at large school, small school, middle school, because this will look very different. And
Right.
I know who did this one, and
Yeah.
it's very doable.
I think that's in your region.
I know, I've been talking with them for some months.
Yeah.
And then the question is, you've already said that you would have to allow some flexibility with it. So the crux of the matter is 2.5 hours of additional instructional time for children, which is that 2.5 hours on Monday, and what you would put in it and what it will cost to do that. And my last question is, because looking at the committees, you have not engaged the subject matter people in this, correct?
So I had representatives from IS that served as a conduit. I had representatives from finance that worked
Right.
on that. I had representatives from IT. My initial, and back to this statement because I want to be clear about it, my initial objective here was to start the conversation to say, let's have something to begin with, right? And if I would have known that I was going to be sitting here today, I would have had the different groups
Right.
of people sitting in that conversation initially.
Right, because I can see how the planning time is, that's in there. I mean, that's clearly a real plus with all of this. The question would be that 2.5 hours of instructional time for children, what would it be? I also know that by creating a uniform day across the week, and looking at this, it looks to me as though each student would have 10 30-minute blocks of special time, and however you construct it.
Over a 2-week period?
No, this is just over a week, because you've got 60 minutes a day. Because you have 60 minutes a day for children that would be specials. And
Right.
some of the specials come in 30-minute blocks, some in 60, some in 90, depending on the subject and what the requirement teaches.
Right. Most of them, I think, in your triple T are 60 or 30s. And,
Right.
you know,
Except
I think
that art-
art is generally a 60, and, you know,
they'd
some
like-
schools, if that's the parameters they're currently operating with,
Right.
they might be in a 90-minute.
The art teachers would like more. We've struggled with that one.
I hear you.
I know that one. So I guess that would be the question is instructionally how you would make that work.
Let me add to some of what
Sure.
you're talking about, is, you know, we have been concerned about, you know, right now, our principals, I think, do a great job of developing their calendar, but of all of our elementary schools, you know, we tried to look at this in the fall, and what we realized is every school has a very, very different calendar, master schedule. Granted, some of our principals are masters at this. Probably others, you know, there's a nuance. It's kind of an art and science kind of thing. And I was an elementary principal, so I know full well this gets difficult. But I think one of the upsides is much more consistency across the system. I think that's an upside for being able to defend and support our master schedules at the elementary level. I think the other upside is ensuring that we're protecting all subject matter. For an example, science. I think we all know that science has gotten the short end of the stick at the elementary level for very legitimate reasons, but we've got to stop that. So this would give us some assurances also. I think that's part of where you were going, is making sure that we protect some of these other subject matter as well.
Right, which I can see that. I think my question is whether or not you can actually put this together in time.
Okay, let me remind.
I can see how this.
Right, and
yeah,
I think
this
it's
looks good for a lot of things that we know that we've got to solve over time.
Let me
Can
tell you
you
a couple of things.
Actually do it.
Yeah, the timeline. You know, initially when we started this work, and I believe Mr. Paris and his team have done a great job. Our timeline was September of 15 for any potential changes, but the weather created a challenge, and then we talked about it in chairman's, and I was encouraged to go ahead and accelerate it, just to bring an option, because it is an important issue to us, and we're really never going to resolve the time issue until we take this on. And there's just lots of reasons why it's a good thing, recognizing the timeline's aggressive and the cost is certainly formidable. So I think both of those reasons are why we're bringing it to you today. Not an ideal timeline, but it is what it is. And then we just felt like we need to all have a conversation about it.
Well, and I guess that's the bottom. Can you truly
can we?
engage the teachers that would be needed in the subject area to make up that 2.5 hours, let alone the cost?
We've had conversations with all the teacher associations and also the principal associations. They're all very supportive of moving this forward. Will it be difficult? Yeah. I've asked that question too. Is this even doable? Is this even doable? Our elementary principals have told me time and time again, have told Dan, yes. Teacher organizations have said, let's do it, even though it may not be perfect the first year. You know, I think the real challenge is whether or not we find the resource to do it. But let's say we said, yes, this is important enough. The way we would probably do this is developing models, because it's very helpful for our principals to have models. So which one's most like my school? Let me see it. Let me see how I could start working with my own staff. And then what we probably need to do is identify a cadre of elementary principals and assign them to other schools to help support the development of these master schedules over the summer. Because we have the expertise within our system, we would need to help them help us deploy it.
One last question. To expand world languages in the elementary school, the challenge that we've had with our immersion teachers is that they have to be highly qualified and they have to be certified in elementary instruction. If we attempted to expand FLES quickly, would those teachers have to have that state certification in elementary education? That has been a huge problem in that area, and where would we find them?
So that's another one of the concerns that we would have to consider. Now, one of the options that Dan has mentioned, excuse me, Mr. Paris, it does include the world languages piece, but this could also be done without that piece as well. So we don't have, 100 foreign world language teachers at the ready that we
Exactly.
have, because we really, because of our de-staffing and our RIFs, we actually pulled back on a lot of our hiring as well. So that's one of the pieces that HR would also have to get up to speed in terms of hiring if we go with the world language model. There are options in here that would not require us to do that as well.
Describe
And to
the
that
option
point,
without
to that
that.
point, it was like I said earlier, I think if we wanted to move forward with this, I think we would have to provide a lot more flexibility. And is there a principal out there that have a great certified foreign language teacher and then he or she could implement? Great. But I think we have to allow some flexibility. If they wanted to add physical education or science lab rotation, depending upon what they may want to have a teacher that does their, I just want like maker's space, where they make that a part of their rotation in terms of project-based learning. So I think we would have to be much more flexible in accommodating that. If we waited a year, we would have another year to really study and think about and be more prescriptive about it. I think there's no way possible we could be prescriptive, I don't think, at this point. Kind of to the certification requirement.
However you go forward with a certified teacher to fill this gap, you will begin a culture that then, if you wish to do something else, subject-wise, then you have a very hard time pulling that back. That would be...
Right, because any of the options would require additional staff.
Right, exactly.
As well.
Exactly.
So,
Okay.
I mean, we do have, to Dr. Garza's point, we've got PE people, we've got music people on tap. It would,
Sure.
again.
Those, our current subject area people, that would be fine. You could fill in. We've got people who could do it. So, okay. I've taken up my time.
And if I could have just a quick go back to clarify the engagement that's still needed. I think when you talk about your employee groups and so forth, looking at this, I think, and I won't speak for them, but I think they would say if you're accounting for teacher-directed planning time within your policies and your regulations of what you do, and you can guarantee it in practice as well, we would support that. And, if you're going to make an adequate investment to make sure that this is spread out so that specialists have the same benefits as core teachers, that's something that we would support, right? So I think you have an agreement in principle, but I think you have people that would say, and that would be what my recommendation is, show me that. I'd like to see the policies. I'd like to see the specialist schedule to get people on board. So the benefit of going slow and taking this apart strategically is people can commit to something with a little more detail than they have right now.
Because that's the last question is the specialists, do they get planning time? Because I will hear from those teachers that they feel short shrift.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Strauss. I have a Mr. Schwartz to be followed by Ms. Hines and Mrs. Reed, Mr. McElveen, Mrs. Smith. I want to allow all board members to ask any and all questions they want to ask, but if in the first round, if we could limit the number of questions, and then we can go back and for the second and third round until we are all done. Mr. Schultz.
Okay. First of all, I know that was very difficult to try to boil down to a single presentation, because I've lost track of how many times we've met on this. So, I mean, kudos. The math that's involved in just a schedule, I've grown for such an appreciation of how difficult this is. Just a couple of things. I know you mentioned it, but the emphasis is that teachers and principals were involved heavily in this, in coming up with this. So it's not that this was created by staff, in a vacuum. This was an integrated process of trying to work this out. That's correct?
Yeah, well, I want to be clear about that, right?
Right.
That this is a topic that's been engaged on a lot of different levels in the past. This working group included principals and staff members, and as I said from the beginning, if I knew I was going to be sitting here launching this in front of the board,
I understand.
I just wanted to start the conversation. So I don't believe we've adequately engaged teachers in this conversation.
Right, but I meant in the working group they were included. There was
In
there was
the
input.
group,
input.
previous groups? Yeah.
I wouldn't say heavily, though.
Okay, okay. Some of the things that I didn't hear in the presentation, that this helps to align with the Portrait of a Graduate and the strategic planning essence of not having pockets of excellence, and that there are some, principals or some schools that have a really excellent calendaring process and others which might not, for whatever reason, and that this will help, kind of have that consistency, that kind of falls into play with, is that correct? So that we don't have that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have some differences in principals and staff at schools to implement the master schedule. I can tell you as a principal, that was a key area of focus for me because you can find efficiencies. It meets the needs of your teachers if you do it well, and if you engage people in a collaborative process, it helps your school culture, right? So if you implement this change, you're going to have some principals that were already in schools that were already well-versed in that. They'll be able to do it. Other schools will need some help to make sure that they implement this practice with efficiency, and that's where we would use some of our executive principals to help with that, and that we would review these schedules to make sure that practice matched policy.
And the beauty is, the value add is, even in the schools that have the good calendaring process now, what this does in the at the elementary level is it basically at least doubles from what's out there, the teacher-directed planning time. So even if it's a good calendar process and it's, everything's working, collaborative time is working, the individual teacher-directed planning time right now will be basically at least doubled. Is that correct?
Okay, I wouldn't say doubled. So the way, just to be
Right.
clear, the way it's in policy right now, it says that teachers are guaranteed 6.5 hours of time not with students. That's a very broad definition in your regulation, right?
Right.
What we're proposing in here is to create, so this time not with students could include anything that happens during the contract day, right? As long as it's not in the instructional day. What we're guaranteeing is, in this model, or proposing, is that you would deliver 8 hours over the 2-week rotation within the confines of the instructional day, and that 240 of those minutes each week would be directed and protected as teacher-directed planning time, which doesn't currently exist with that level of specificity.
Right. So
in
there's
the
no
regulation.
preservation of that time at this point. And if I recall, like the numbers were like 98 minutes to 105 minutes was kind of about what was found in terms of teacher, preserved teacher planning time theoretically, but without a policy to back it up. And that this would kind of take that to the 240 minutes. So it does, in the end, while it's the time away in the classroom or the time away, this now gets to that unencumbered teacher time and teacher-directed time, and having that with a policy to back it up is something that we haven't had. Is that right? Okay. And then the other thing that I didn't hear about, which I have heard in the past, and I don't see Mr. Plattenberg, is that there's been an issue in the past of hiring bus drivers and the difficulty of trying to maintain bus drivers when 20% of their week is different, and that having a consistent day will lead to better, easier hiring practices, instead of like, okay, well, 80% of the week is this and 20% of the week is this, that will have some, foreseeable improvement in that. Dr. Pichardo?
Sure. So I do know that for the last 2 years, at the start of the school year, we have had enough bus drivers, meaning enough to cover the routes. Where in previous years we have not started, we've been in a deficit and people have been tripling and quadrupling, et cetera. That doesn't mean that during the course of the year that we are able to retain them, but at least at the start. I do think that there are still some complications, and Mr. Perry spoke to that regarding some of our employee groups, to include bus drivers. We're going to do, with this proposal, we move to the 990 hours. It's not a certain amount of days that people are given. And so in addition to engaging our teachers, we would also have to engage our support staff around, so what does a level day look like for a bus driver? Do we also have to now make some reductions in contracts, or say for other support staff, instructional assistants, PHTAs, et cetera, food service folks, parent liaisons, anyone that's working on an hourly basis right now, we'd have to make some considerations, but that's the longer view of all of these things.
But I'm talking specifically about, it's been harder to get because of the Monday different schedule, that's harder, and that having a consistent day all 5 days will, allow us to bridge that difficulty.
I will say in the conversation on another subject matter on Blueprint for Change, that has come up before this board from the consultants about that would create some efficiencies around a standardized day. There are some efficiencies to having that consistent.
So, I mean, and that's the big takeaway, is that there are a lot of different things. I mean, in the end, we're talking about a calendar, but I hear it supports clearly the teacher workload, which was one of the primary things to address. Plus, if you get a policy that backs that up, for the first time, this division will be carving it out, setting up some models, and having that consistency, which also supports Portrait of a Graduate. I think there's a visibility to parents that if your student goes to school in one end of the county versus another, like trying to figure out, does my student have the same specials available to my student as in someplace else? Are they getting the same recess? Are they getting the same? And knowing that there is kind of a consistent model. And then the transportation and hiring practices. So I see this thread that you're getting to, like this. There's a common thread of a lot of different things that this solves. So those are just some of the initial questions I had.
Okay, thank you. As I stated earlier, I want board members to focus on asking questions now, and then we'll have a discussion after all the questions are done with. I have Ms. Hines, Mrs. Reed, Mr. McAlvey, Mrs. Smith, and Mr. Kofax. Ms. Hines.
Okay, thank you. Going to slide 8, where you talked about the different ways that you might be able to fill that time, right?
Can you click?
It's
Can you take it to
triple
slide
T
8?
and, yeah, well, as you're getting to it.
Okay.
I was just wondering, I didn't see on there AAP resource teachers. And, the only reason I thought about it and wondered if it came up in your conversations is that I know principals use those people in different ways in different buildings, but I've been in buildings where, I'll get a half hour off as a teacher because the AAA resource teacher comes in and does a lesson with my class. So I was wondering if that was something that came up when we talk about a math lab or a science lab, that might be the right person to do it, and they're already hired. So is that something you thought about?
I think it's definitely something that the elementary principals thought about. I didn't capture it on this slide, and I think part of this is the reason that you would have full engagement is that you would capture the collective best thinking from the organization about how to do it. So I'll make a note that, I think these 4 things are currently in practice in some schools right now, and finding a thoughtful balance that was viewed as a win-win by everybody in that situation or the culture in that school would be important. And I think AAP could also be considered in that conversation.
Thank you. All right, and then going to slide 9, and I think, I don't know why I had slide, oh yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting. Just yesterday I had a conversation with one of the principals in my district, right? And she wanted to talk to me about, working conditions and workload and, how she was trying to address that with her teachers and was concerned about planning time. And so I asked her, well, what's your current balance, right? And she said, well, 2 hours a week they have CLT meetings. 1 hour a week they have teacher-directed planning time. So that's 2 to 1 right now in practice in that school. And what we're talking about going to is 1 to 4, basically, right? 1 hour of CLT, or one part
75
CLT to
minutes.
4 parts, right, teacher-directed. And when I talked to her about that, she said, well, that's sort of coming down to me from above. And so I guess when I hear that and then I see this, I do kind of wonder about fidelity of implementation. I mean, are we asking the folks from Gatehouse and, all Fairfax and the Ridge on down to do things that they are not prepared to do?
So I think in watching the development of collaborative work, it works in this way. If people don't believe it, they don't buy in, then they believe this is something that's imposed upon them, right? I'm a believer that structured collaborative work, and the ideal way to be deployed is that the teachers would control that, right? But I think it has to have some understood structure in it. As teams develop that and they start to capture benefits to their work from it, that it eases their workload, that it helps share the collective capacities of their team, there are certain teams that would say, okay, well, we can't limit ourselves only to doing it this one time a week. We want to do more, right? So you have some variances in how it's perceived. As a key driver, structured collaborative work that's focused on a few strategic things that improve student learning, that you capture the collective best thinking of your group, is one of the most important improvement drivers you can deliver, right? So there is a balance in here, and I think that's one thing that was open to talk about if we had more time. I mean, I think, based on having been in the organization for a long time, that these are reasonable points to begin the conversation to say, is this the right balance? Some schools, so I think you would set minimal standards, and then depending on where the team evolution would be, they could certainly choose and elect to go more than that if they wanted to.
So they meaning the teachers?
Correct.
Not the principal?
Right.
Okay.
But I do believe, in changing culture, sometimes when you ask people to do stuff that they're not necessarily believing is the right thing, I always say I let student results prove if that's correct or not. So if I'm asking you to do the right things within respected minimums, and you may not believe it at the beginning, and you start to see it and it starts returning the results we all want, then it gains buy-in.
Yeah, sure, yeah, and I think what the burden kind of that she was talking about was just because, it's so heavily weighted right now toward
Right.
directed CLT time, we're going to tell you what to do with your time, whereas it's 2 to 1.
So part of the benefits of this is the way our regulations are written, it's team time, not with students, right? So that can be met in a lot of different ways. We're trying to bring some clarity to say, in the work that we do with working conditions to understand it, there's certain times that you collaborate with your team. There's certain times you need that protected time to do the work you need to do, and it should be captured within the instructional day. And, that some level of standardizing this so that it, mitigates those kinds of conditions is important.
Okay, thanks. So on another slide, you talked about the cost of substitutes, and I can't remember what slide that was, but it got me thinking about one of the things that principals have done lately is, in the last few years, is to have data days and lesson study days, where teachers are out of the classroom and there are subs in there. And so I'm wondering, is the idea that this new schedule will make that sort of thing unnecessary?
So I think what you would find, and my wife's probably going to kill me from throwing her in here, would say, okay, if you're going to pull me out of my classroom to do professional development, it better be darn good professional development. And what you're pulling me out to do, it better be really worth it, right? Because if I'm not there, then, I would hope that a substitute couldn't deliver the same quality instruction that a trained teacher could, right? Although some of them are great, and I was one. But anyway, so I think by creating these days where you have strategic planning, it may well be that the principal says, this is the best use of your time, is look at all the information you have on kids, begin to intervene and make those changes, and that those would move into days that don't pull teachers out of the classroom, okay?
Okay. So
And I
that,
think, go ahead.
so it sounds like that might be a result, but we're not really sure that that's something we're shooting for? Or?
like an unintended consequence. I mean, I do know also, as you know from the working condition survey, there was a concern about our delivery of professional development. So this gives us an opportunity as well to consider how we redeploy professional development, get it closer to teacher choice as well, and giving options, et cetera. So.
And I wanted to clarify around the estimates for substitutes. That was for personal leave and sick leave. So the monies that are deployed for professional development are put into different accounts and not included in that estimate.
Right,
But
okay.
you'll remember, we've reduced our expenditures in those areas. So we're going to be forced as a system to reexamine how we're delivering and what we're supporting throughout the division. Gives us an opportunity to kind of level set again and really provide a little bit more focus around our professional development next year.
Okay, just a couple more questions. Thank you. On slide 12, you talked about increasing the ratio on the FLES teachers, right? And I wasn't clear, would the ratio increase because the classroom teacher would no longer be in the room, or would you be adding more students to the FLES teachers' responsibilities?
Okay. Assuming that the teacher teaches five, if it was a period deployment, which is not, but it's the easiest way to see it, that you'd have 7 periods, that the teacher would teach 5 of these blocks. If they went to 1 to 600, that's 24. I think the math is 24 kids in a class, which is a pretty reasonable class size load.
Okay, all right. So we're not, yeah, because I visited a FLES class, and the teacher was going from, she had like 20 minutes for lunch. The whole day was her only break. So I'm just thinking they're already kind of overloaded, but.
And that's where I'm talking back to engaging and making sure that your policy equates to your practice. And our recommendation is to make sure that these tolerances were in there for all employees.
All right, one last question on the calendar. Just looking at the colored days, the blue teacher workday and the goldenrod teacher workday, I just wanted to make sure I understand the difference between them as a policy matter. The one says teacher-directed workday planning day, and the other just says teacher workday. So what's the difference in the instructions that the principals would have on how to use those days?
So we've had some evolution in the past around teacher-directed workdays. That in the past we've had teacher workdays, and there's been sometimes teachers would come back and other employees and say these are completely taken up by the school that they direct, and say, okay, that they're structuring what happens with that time, right? So by delineating this, you have some that are protected, which we currently have, but you also have additional protections that show up in the yellow days, because at least half of those 4 days is protected as teacher directed time. Okay. So the ones that are shown in blue, that's not really a change in the practice that we have right now. I look at, like, most of those blue days show up at the beginning of the year, and as somebody that's launched 28 school years within a school, some of it as a teacher and some of it as administrator, there are set things you have to do in a sequential order in order to get it open. So there's a lot more direction that happens in there, and finding a balance about what's needed to get the classroom ready for kids to be received. I could talk more about that if you want. But
Well, if we could just look at that week in August, I just want to know. So for the teacher, it looks like the Wednesday, the teacher would probably not be able to be in the classroom, right? Because that's the
Right.
in-service day, no way to be in the
Right.
classroom. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, school by school, whether the teacher could be in the classroom on those days, right?
So the kind of things that are in there, right? So one of those days, you probably have an orientation for kids that are coming in, right? So that is something that is important. So that's probably taking up 2 hours or 4 hours of the day in order to do it. What I see with schools trying to maximize this, many of these schools, just about all of them now, go to what they call a virtual opening to try to give teachers a chance to click off a lot of these administrative things to put more time back in the classroom. In that opening of week, I would say it, I think my wife would say it, that you're not going to have, the time it takes to get your classroom ready to be the way that you want it to be is probably not captured within that opening week.
Yeah, so that's what I'm thinking. So then you look at Friday. I'm
So
sorry.
let me be clear on the teacher-directed. I'm going to ask Dr. Pajardo to weigh in. We've had a practice of the teacher-directed has a different connotation with it. It's a recognition that teachers spend a lot of hours beyond the traditional day grading papers, getting their classes ready, conferencing with parents after school, intervention. And so our teacher-directed day, and I don't want to speak, is really at the discretion of the teacher. So that means if you're in the building, you're in the building. If you're at home grading papers, is that correct, Dr. Pajardo?
Yes, as we've defined teacher-directed workday, we have said it's your choice. There to be no meetings imposed by administration. Certainly, if a group of teachers wanted to get together and say, let's meet, but a teacher could also say, I choose not to, as well. And that can be done from anywhere. That can be done at home. That can be done partially at the work site and partially at home. That could be done at TMPC or any place else. It really is your time.
Great, so that's what the 29th would be. There's not, and maybe I misunderstood, but I thought I heard Mr. Paris say that was like a half and half day?
No, the yellow days, the strategic planning days have half of that protected for
Oh, I got you.
teacher-directed
So the
time.
dark yellow
Yeah.
is fully teacher-directed the whole day? Is
Right,
that the
it's a
idea? Okay.
teacher-directed day.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I have Mrs. Reed to be followed by Mr. McElvin and Mrs. Smith and Mr. Kovacs.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. Quickly, I wanted to just also say thank you. I thought this was very clear, and it was really very helpful, I think. And I feel like it's the perfect storm. There's been a lot of issues that we've been talking about, and we're realizing now they're all interrelated. And frankly, this seems like a good fix to many issues that we've been talking about. I'm getting to my questions. One of my questions was the net cost. You alluded to the fact that there could be some potential cost savings, but will rolling this out have costs associated with it? And at the end of the day, do we have even a ballpark of what the net cost would be?
Yeah, I think on one of the slides, and you do have an investment that I think your minimal investment for doing this, and I can't say that I have it down to a decimal point of what it would be because I don't know exactly which option we would pick. But as a minimum, I think you're looking at $4 million to do it, and then it would go up from there to do if you choose to do the world languages as proposed. The cost that we have right now for it, the net cost is $7.6 million. So the range is somewhere in there to what it would cost to do this.
And then, though, does that also incorporate the savings that you alluded to, or no?
Did not calculate in the offsets of the $150,000 a day
Okay.
because I couldn't count on exactly how many of those days you would have. If it was 1990, you would have 0.
Right, okay. And again,
So-
order of magnitude, so that
Right.
does give us the idea. Thank you. And then my next question is, why wouldn't we do this next year? I mean, I've heard a little bit about that. You're alluding to, I mean, there's kind of domino effects and things you'd have to work out. But is there a compelling reason to not roll it out now in the
So I think
next school year?
my own opinion would be that I think this is a solid idea. I think it does require some more engagement. And I think if you push it up fast, so I think you find more efficiencies if you're thoughtful with it. You're capturing, like we talked about AAP, how could that be incorporated? You have principals trying to figure out how to make their master schedules work. So if I have more time to work with them to make sure that their collective thinking about how to do this is at a higher level, it's going to be more efficient. If I have to push it up, then probably you're going to have schools that come back and say, we can't figure this out. We need more investment in our triple T to make this work. So I think part of the cost would be that if you pump the timeline up, you're going to accept the fact there's going to be some of these inefficiencies. You would accept the fact you haven't collected, the collective best thinking from some people because you haven't anticipated all the things, all the rough edges that might need to be changed. In principle, I think this is a very solid idea that I think is a good direction for the district to go. Is there still work to work out some of these things? Absolutely yes, and I can't emphasize that enough. Okay.
Another question quickly is, have you identified, or could you tell us what the relationship would be with the later start time initiative? Kind of begs the question when we go to these public meetings, is that in kind of the too hard pile for today and something we would need to look at?
Well, you haven't
anticipating
changed-
someone
yeah.
will ask it if I don't, so.
So you haven't changed the box that you're working with. Really what you've changed is the way you define the instructional day of the elementary school to reflect the work that's actually done there, to define it as 410 minutes. But in terms of the operation of the elementary school, other than saying this is how the work is actually done, you haven't changed the time box that it's operating in. High school and middle school would stay the same. So the tension points of going to Blueprint for Change, I think, that in my analysis would not be, I don't think it would create additional costs or things like that to do this in conjunction with that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McElveen.
Thank you, Mr. Moon, and I would just follow on with what Ms. Reed said, that I think the political timing is right for this. We've just come off a year where people have experienced the trauma of not having something like this in place. So I think it's good that we've brought it forward now. I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm going to make one comment because I'm going to be heading out, and that is, you know, when we engaged with employees and the community in this, and this is no means faulting you or it's just part of our system, but when we refer to Triple T, that's a very derogatory statement. And as a system, I've brought this up before, you know, we believe that music, arts, sports, all that is part of our core, you know, so we shouldn't be all lumping it into something called specials. So I hope we can find a different way to refer to that.
I appreciate that feedback. It's the first time I've heard of that. And of course, I've never heard of it described this way anywhere else I've ever been. But so we'll work on that. I do think one of the upsides maybe that is associated with what you're talking about is a consistent recess. We'd be able to have a consistent recess for kids every day. I think at the elementary level, that's got to be reflective of a core value of the well-rounded student and the need for physical activity and release during the school day. And so I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McElveen. Are you leaving now, or? Okay. Mr. Smith and Mr. Koufax.
He wants to wait to hear what I have to say. I do have a lot of comments that I hope that we do get a chance to make, but I'll keep it to questions now. And my concern is you don't have the answers. So you talked about music, and it's not uniform in all schools, and then kids could be able to choose band, strings, or something. Is what you're really saying in that is that general music would no longer be a requirement for students?
I think what the suggestion would be is that where it's feasible, so in smaller schools, I don't think it would change much in the way that it's done, because I think if you're sharing a band or strings teacher a certain number of times a week, you're probably not going to be able to incorporate it into Triple T. But if you accept this as a recommendation, then yes, you'd have kids would have to make some choices. They wouldn't be able to do all 4 music experiences. They'd have to choose a subset of those music experiences.
And I believe, if not mistaken, that general music would still be a required course
grades.
through grades 3, in some cases through grades 4, because we don't offer orchestra, band, and those other opportunities until later in their elementary experience. So I believe that's what elementary principals have.
Right, I was about to jump in to say that, so general music would still be the case in the the lower primary grades, yeah.
For some students, it would even continue. But I think what was suggested by elementary principals, if they're in choir and strings and choral, could those take the place of the general music in those cases, I believe.
So, equity, pockets of excellence, I mean, this is going to underlay it. That's a concern for me. And I don't think we're going to be able to have the answers. Next question, I'll editorialize later. You talked about in that planning calendar that once every other week, they had the extra 30 minutes of the planning time. What happens to the kids during that planning time?
So that's where you're talking about, in the thinking would be for that extra 30-minute period, you focus efforts that are already currently in the building, like the counselor lessons, et cetera. These are things that they get currently, but they aren't really positioned in a place that creates time for teachers. But if you move them into that block that you created, the kids would be engaged with those support personnel to do it.
Thank you. I don't think I understand what you said about the length of the elementary day with the dismissal time. I understand the fact that, okay, it's listed your dismissal time is 3:20, but really you don't get done dismissing the kids till 3:30. So are you stating the date goes from whatever till 3:30, or are you just knowing that you're capturing that time? I didn't
Yeah,
understand
I think
that.
it's mainly how, you have plenty of hours if you go to a uniform Monday that would be in the elementary school, but to characterize the work a way that it actually exists, right? That our policy says time not with students. The state policy, it leaves it open. It says your beginning and end time. So I'm saying that you have a time not with students and time with students, that right now, the way we're defining it, we're defining time with students as time not with students because they actually supervise them for those additional 10 minutes, and we should account for it in a way that more accurately reflects the work.
So it's really just an accounting process?
Right.
Okay.
But it's an accounting process that recognizes the actual work
Right,
that goes on in the
right,
school, which
right.
I think is important.
I was just confused if you were going to kind of change the dismissal time, but kids were going to
No,
start getting, that's what
just
was
the way
con-
that you account for
Right,
it.
okay. I do want to clarify, slide 8, the last bullet. And I think that is the part that there really aren't any answers of that, of how we do that and how we clarify that, what that would be.
Okay, so a couple different comments on that. So right now, it says in regulation that a media center specialist can provide up to 10 hours of focused instruction to provide time for teachers, right? So, and you have counselors, which have an expectation to deliver certain lessons in the classroom. And you have APs that are supposed to deliver certain types of instruction around SR&R and things on a regular basis. So my thinking is, right now, these things are not targeted in a structured sort of way to create time for teachers, and it may well be possible to move those into a structure that you would create, which is the schedule that we have, to make sure that it does that. And any of these flexibility options that you choose not to do, they can be offset by additional investment in Triple T and those kinds of things if you choose that methodology. I was just trying to find a balance of using the pieces that we already have in place to be as efficient as possible, combined with an additional investment to make this occur.
And I just want to make one more clarification because this was said earlier. My understanding is that although in the past in some of the other studies you referenced, teachers might have been involved, in this work group, there were no teachers in the work group.
Right, I'm acknowledging that straight up front, right? And my intention was to use this work to begin the conversation like we're having about today, but the certain tension points that are around this said bring it up sooner. If I knew that we were going to actually be considering launching this right from the beginning, I would have included a different group, right?
Mr. Koufax.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. I will be making comments because I am also going to the College Partnership Program. So I want to start with Mr. Paris. You have created such a win-win here. Thank you so much for all of your hard work. When I look at those calendars and everything that's in them and the schedule that can be out there, I think just congratulations on doing that because that was difficult, and I appreciate all of your hard work. However, I have concerns. And your considerations to launch, I think we need to look at those as a board very much and delve deeper into each of those and question that. Very briefly, because I do have to leave, these are my concerns for a 2014 implementation, not for a longer one, but for 2014. I think when we look at different schools, you had stated that larger schools have more flexibility. Veteran principals may be able to complete this in a seamless way. But what about the smaller schools? What about the less established principals? I'm concerned about the cost, and that kind of is a question that I will ask later. I'm concerned about the costs. I am concerned about the fidelity of implementation. I believe that sometimes some of our programs, when they're rolled out too quickly, flexibility can translate into a lack of equity of programming, so that makes me a little bit nervous. You know, the obvious, that teachers will get more time to plan and prepare, except this first year when we're going to roll this out in July and they have to implement it in September. And I feel with the other changes that are going on, with our reorganization, with assistant cluster superintendents perhaps establishing and rebuilding relationships in new areas, perhaps depending on where everything falls out, I think what you said more time equal more efficient. So my initial approach in looking at this tonight is saying I'd like to take a more strategic approach to get it done right, but that in no way takes away from anything that you've done or the great plan that you've laid out from it. But those are my concerns at this point in time. And perhaps we can get to those before, full implementation would need to take place in this calendar year, but there's some big concerns there.
Agreed.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. With that, let me go to Ms. Evans.
Yes, thanks very much. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. Does this not add time to the elementary school day Tuesday through Friday?
Tuesday through Friday?
Tuesday through
No,
Friday.
what I'm offering is
So
that
it's the
we're
same.
defining the work as it actually occurs.
I see.
Because there's a lot of
Okay.
time in
That's-
elementary school, they come in the morning, you
Right.
have breakfast responsibilities, you have a rollout.
Right.
So I'm just trying to more accurately define the work the way it exists.
So if the bell schedules stay the same, the bell schedules would still,
The bell
it wouldn't
right.
lengthen.
So the bell schedules could stay the same. The way that you're accounting for the hours would be at the actual bus
I-
departure time.
Because of the bus departure, I
Right, but you're going to
understand.
have more
Right.
tolerances in the elementary day than you need anyway, but,
Okay.
okay.
And on the calendar, so you're suggesting that these are two approaches to changing the calendar that would, I guess I'm trying to understand the two versions. I understand that Veterans Day is the one difference, but this would then add if I'm reading this right, and tell me if I am or not, does this add 4 days that then students would be off of school? Is that what we're doing here?
So right now in your base model, you have a 183-day schedule,
Right.
right? Which we anticipate that we're going to use, we say, that schedule says you're probably going to use at least 3 of those days on any given year.
Right.
So that you're going to work toward a 180-day schedule.
Right.
So within this model, because you're going to account for the hours in a different way by increasing the time in the day, that you start with a 180-day calendar, which I think is, and then
Okay.
those days that previously were banked, right, to anticipate
Right.
the snow, you can use those to incorporate in the base schedule these strategic planning days and teacher-directed, with half of it being teacher-directed.
So we would need to be making sure that people know that, October 14th, for example, and I guess I would want to compare these two calendars with what the
Yeah.
currently adopted calendar is. But, so the 14th, for example, currently is a school day, right? And then it would become now a teacher work day where the students would be off of school, correct?
I think probably the bigger picture answer to that is these options that Dan walked through would not even be in play unless you all said, let's move forward with the change in the elementary
Right.
school schedule.
Because they're all,
This is
they're all
lumped
one.
with this.
Right.
If we say, let's keep working on this, let's not do this until the next year, then what I talked about earlier would remain the same with that little minor tweak.
Minor tweak. And I guess that's where I'm going with this, that if we do proceed, quickly to do this, we would also need to do this in order to make it work. Okay, and so we would be having, at least I'm counting 4 more days that students would have off of school. Is that right? We've got the October,
They'd have 180 days in the schedule as opposed to
okay,
183
so somewhere,
days.
okay, all right. Well, I thought I counted 4, but I'll recount. And so then, I guess my last question is on the foreign language piece of this. So we would be asked then, as part of this process, to decide whether we would want to add FLES or whether we would want to go into a different direction with a different kind of language program. Is that one of the decisions we would need to be making?
You all put together or asked for a working group to develop a proposal around foreign language.
Right.
And that strategic goal as a system.
Right.
So this other committee has been working on that also. And
Okay.
you're actually scheduled at one of the work sessions, it's coming up soon, June 16th, is that what it was?
June
I'm-
16th.
Okay.
That's scheduled real soon for them to present their report.
Okay.
And so Dan included some of what I think they're kind of foreshadowing what they're going to talk about. But again, I'm going to reemphasize, I think given if we were to move forward, I think the timeline's too aggressive to say it has to be a certain way, because I think every schedule, what we're going to have to do is sit down with elementary schools and determine which way is best for them to make this work. Because of the certification requirements that was brought up earlier by Ms. Strauss, I think it would be very difficult for us to get that done in the shorter time frame.
So maybe we would end up
We'd have to give a little more
staying with what we have
flexibility.
now on the foreign language piece, but then
No, I
moving?
think in some circumstances, if they had the the right appropriately certified teacher,
Okay.
and it was something that that school wanted to implement, it was important to that school, I think there's a way to do it. But I would think we're going to have to give a lot more flexibility given the timeline.
And that's all my questions for now.
Okay. Board member for go back or Mr. Stork, if you have any question to ask. Okay, I have a Ms. Hines and Mr. Strauss.
So I just maybe following up a little bit. What happens then if we don't do this for fall 2014? And two things, that kind of has two parts. What happens to teacher planning time? And what happens to the snow day issue?
Okay, let me go to the first one first, the snow day issue. The minor schedule change or banking of that day is really the only option we have available to us, and hopefully that would be sufficient to meet our needs, okay, in terms of snow days. We would have to continue to meet the requirement on the 180 days. So we'll need the 3 days in there that are banked, and we'll need that option to use January the 29th if we find that we're going to have another one of those winters, okay? Because we cannot, under our current elementary schedule, we cannot meet the requirement on the 990 hours, okay? The first part of your question had to do with what do we do about teachers and the concern with regard to their time. I think there's some things that we can do to protect under our current constraints, looking at how we're planning and how we're utilizing the early release, that 2.5 hours on Monday. I think we would have to protect that time, and there's some ways I think that we can do that. We have been using a good bit of that time, I think once a month, for division-wide professional development. We will have to take a serious look at that. We'll also have to give some guidance to our principals about how do we protect that time also for teachers, because what's happening is that time is being used, eaten up with meetings. Again, it's going to continue to be just tweaking because we're looking at our current configuration and how we meet those needs. So there's a limited amount of things we can do, and like I said, I'm open to whatever we can take off their plate, but it's limited within the current constraints. That makes sense.
Well, yeah, just to follow up, I mean, the same principal I was talking to said, 2 Mondays a month are taken up with staff meetings or the professional development that they're doing. So that's half their time is gone. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Strauss and Mrs. Smith.
Okay, obviously, what is being proposed is ideally where we need to get to at some point. I mean, this is right, yeah, because certainly we've been discussing this for 20 years now. And coincidentally, the last time we really looked at it was 1989-90, and I think it would have cost us $15 million at that time. We were going to do the 7-period day at the high school level, and then we had the next plan, which was to do the uniform. This before all your time. You were there. Okay, maybe we're on the same. And then we ran out of money, and so that was that. And I am assuming that we cannot go back to a uniform 6-hour day. It no longer fits into the transportation schedule of the high school busing. It used to be Ellen Lees told us that many years ago. And while that would create planning time for teachers after school, that would not give us any additional time for students, nor would that give us the opportunity to build in more snow days. But I am correct in that a uniform 6-hour day no longer fits the transportation requirement of the high school day and the buses. Yes? Who remembers that day that Ellen Lee said, no, we can't go back?
Can I ask a clarifying question? Yeah. Would the 6-hour day predicate a return to a 6-period day?
Well, that's my understanding. I remember when we went to the 7-period day, because we had to extend, not only create 7 periods, but we extended the high school day. But then it made it impossible to go back to a uniform 6-hour day for elementaries because you could not schedule the buses.
Right, and I don't know if this is the correct answer to it, but I do know that if you reverted to a 6-period day with the requirements for graduation that are mandated
Oh, we
now,
couldn't.
you
Not
couldn't
for a high
attain
school.
the credits required.
Right. No, but I was saying for a consistent 6-hour day at the elementary, I don't think we can go back to that before the 1970s, early closing on Monday.
Okay.
A uniform 6-hour elementary day, I think, is no longer an option.
Yeah, I can't answer that, I don't know.
We need Alan.
I don't know about the first part of that question. The second part of that question, though, had to do with if you had everyone's planning time at the end of the day.
Right.
So you're just adding time onto the day. And so,
Right.
number one. Secondly, that time wouldn't count, as you pointed out.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
Toward
that-
expanding, increasing instructional time.
No, I know.
So we'd still be back in the same
Right.
place.
We would not have solved all of the problem, but I just wanted to make sure, because the no-cost option, because parents will say, can't we just have a consistent Monday through Friday? Let's just reverse what was done in the 1970s. My response was, we can no longer do that. It doesn't fit with the larger master schedule.
Okay.
Right, and it doesn't. I guess my other question, Dr. Garza, in whether or not we can do this in time for the fall, how would we know? How would we get more information in order to actually be able to roll this out in a quality way in all schools? Because I know some schools could do this now. I'm not confident that we could do this in a quality way for everybody. How will you let us know that this is doable?
Okay, there's a couple of things that we can do. And granted, as I mentioned in my first comments, because of the aggressive nature of this timeline, we would have to have some tolerance about it would not be perfect. But I think there's some ways that we can provide support to individual principals throughout the summer and helping them get there. Really, and I think utilizing some of our own talent within our system. We have some principals out there who understand this very, very well.
Right, I know.
And it's really helping. We'd have to tap
Right.
into
I sent
to
a few of them to you.
Yes, but I think the key issue is, are we comfortable dedicating resource to this?
And I guess the other question I would have, will there be
Money.
an opportunity for us to discuss this one more time very quickly, where we would talk to a principal of a large, middle, and small, and then some of the curriculum area people to say, how, if we did this by this fall, what would you do?
I think it's a very good suggestion. I think that would absolutely be necessary. The chairman and vice chairman, I don't want to speak, I know they can speak for themselves, felt like this was important for at least the board to have this conversation and for you to give us some direction about, do we need to continue to accelerate and move this work forward, or can we just continue to study it with a proposal later on for September of 15?
Right.
So I believe that's the purpose of this conversation today, for you all to give us guidance. Do we need to continue to do this in the way in which we're doing it in terms of an accelerated fashion? And I think we could schedule some more time.
I would love one more opportunity. And my back of
that's
the envelope
possible.
on the cost is, I think it will cost more than what we think. I think it's within the window that you've put out here. But, and then, obviously, our employee groups would have to understand that if we adopt this and we put the money in this pot, it can't be put in another pot. So this would significantly help the teacher workload for the elementary teachers, absolutely.
And I think it would be an investment. I do think we have to, if we don't do it this year, and I think we have to get it done at some point. And I think we can get it done this year. I think it is a lofty challenge, I will tell you. But I do think it's an investment in additional instructional time, which I think has extraordinary value. And I think it's an investment in our teachers.
I
And
agree
I think
with
it
you.
would send a strong signal to our elementary teachers where we continue to hear that, I mean, this is the real long-term fix.
It is, and I agree with you. It's just then people have to understand, we put the money here, it can't go somewhere else. So, thank you.
Okay, I have Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Schwartz. We are still asking questions.
Oh, I was going to start commenting because I want to be able to get to
Okay,
Madison.
questions first, and then I'll get to the discussion. Mrs. Smith, are you done with the questions?
I guess.
Okay, Mr. Schwartz, you have questions?
Just what would, if we don't do this, is there any demonstrable way that we address standards of accreditation issues and teacher workload issues? I mean, the changes have to happen anyway, from what I'm hearing. So we either tweak now or tweak later. We either fix now or we have to tweak now and fix later. And would it be more complicated with any start time to try to do all of it at the same time versus ease into, doing this fix, having the experience of this fix, and then next year? I mean, is there a sense that this would be easier to do, one fix one year and one the following year, or just make it a bigger, hill to climb next year? How's that for a
Okay, let's see.
unpinned
If I had my
Band-Aid?
crystal ball, I could look in it right now. I think that's all conjecture on our part because we don't know. I think those are all very important questions. I'm not sure that we have the answers on those questions, right? And that is it easier to make this change? Because you're right, we've got to tweak. This is our real long-term solution to some of the teacher workload challenges, which is predominantly at the elementary level. Is it easier to make this change and really dig in deep and work on it this summer, and then next year take on potentially the blueprint for changes, start time changes? There may be a school of thought that say do it all at one time. I'm sorry I don't have a definitive answer, but I think it is a worthwhile thought to put on the table. How do we strategically roll out these changes?
Mr. Schultz, you done? Okay. Any other board member with a question? Okay, Ms. Hines.
Question, I'm sorry, I'm back again. So I just want to know sort of what our next steps would be. For example, when would we vote on doing this? When would we vote on the money? And how would we figure out where the money comes from?
I think that will be the part of discussion later.
Okay, but we're not voting tonight.
Oh, we're
are
not
we?
voting tonight.
Okay,
We're
so
not
when-
voting tonight.
So when do
We
we?
will
we'll talk
have
about-
that
I got it.
discussion
All right, sorry.
after the
Okay.
questions are done. I have Mr. Storr, questions?
I wasn't here obviously earlier, and I apologize for that, but I asked, and I didn't get a clear answer on the 48 minutes per day. That's, in essence, dedicated for teachers to have self-directed, self-managed time. Is that 48 include before and after kids leave, or is that somewhat during the day? I mean, right now they have time beginning of the day, end of the day when the kids are gone. What is that? Where does that 48 minutes come from? I looked on here, I didn't see it, so help me with that, please.
Right, so the regulation currently accounts for time not with students to be 6.5 hours over a 2-week rotation. What this proposal does is it places time within the instructional day and creates 8 hours over that same period. It does not take advantage of time that's dedicated to collaboration, nor does it take into fact time that sits outside of what we currently define as the instructional day. So there's 240 minutes per week when you average it out over the 2-week rotation, which would be protected as teacher-directed work time and would be accounted for within the regulation.
Which I guess I need to ask the question again because I still don't understand the response you gave me.
Okay.
So before beginning of the day time that teachers have traditionally had, the end of the day time teachers have traditionally had without students there, is that included in the 48 minutes, or is this within the day itself, though, where there's, again, band or
Right.
some other kind of special time that's provided, they will have 48 minutes for use that's self-directed?
That time that currently exists before the student day and after the student day would continue to exist. The 240 minutes that we're proposing is within the structured schedule.
Okay, thank you.
And it would be it would be the exact 48 minutes a day or the equivalent thereof. I just wanna be
240
clear.
minutes a
Yeah.
week, basically, yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, now with that, we are gonna go into the discussion. I know I'm gonna be calling Mrs. Smith first. Let's keep in mind, because staff is seeking a guidance from the board. Guidance from the board, let's keep that in mind. What kind of a guidance do we wanna give to staff? Should we tell staff to forget about this? Should we tell staff to do this, this kind of, more work on this area and come back to us by a certain time? Should we tell the, staff that we are going for full implementation from September 2014? Keep that in mind. Or I do not want to do this, at least not until September 2015. That could be part of this discussion. And if you just want to tell me that, Mr. Chairman, I need more time to think about this. I just want to schedule another work session soon so that I can come back and give a more thoughtful, suggestion on this. That's another way to go about. All right, with that, Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, Chairman Moon. I think this is really a very creative, well-thought plan to get us to more equity with planning time for teachers. I think it's a creative way to look at our calendar issues. I think compared to discussions in the past that it's not as expensive as other thoughts to deal with this. So I think it's a great place we need to go. With that being said, I think my biggest concern first starts with who knows. I have to tell you, I was very not happy when I heard in the press about this, and I wasn't even really aware that this was going down the road about this. So then when I think of how I felt about this as a board member, and now I think about all the people teaching in schools that really don't know much about what's happening with this, and we're not getting feedback, that concerns me. We got a great email from music program person that really stated some of the issues that need to be solved. So I hear a lot of creative ideas. I just want us to be able to do this right so we meet the needs of our kids properly, that it's equitable across the system, that we are respectful of the work and the time of counselors or librarians, and that we take the time to look at their current work requirements, whatever new changes there would be. I love the idea that we have a way to get to the foreign language that's one of our goals for kids, that we could do that and reach our goal for all kids getting that, because that's part of our priorities and student achievement goals for kids to achieve that. I agree. How do you hire 90 or 100 teachers for next year? I don't see it happening. So as much as I think this is a great idea, I think about other times when we've rolled things out so quickly, we really haven't had feedback from the community, from the teaching staff. I can't support going forward for 2015 without a lot more things answered and having engagement. And with everything else that's going on, I don't see how we get to the richness of the details in that kind of time frame. It really concerns me.
So what is your guidance?
I think that we continue to work this. We engage with teachers. We engage with the community, whatever pieces. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I heard in this presentation, if we had more time. Well, then we should take more time and do this right. And I understand we want to get to the workload things for teachers and all that. I think this is great. I used to teach elementary, and my mother taught high school, and I used to be so irritated with her planning time compared to mine. I have to say one other thing. Back in 2002 or 3, when I was first on the school board, I suggested early release days for planning time so we could count a day, and the superintendent at that time didn't like my idea. I just don't see how we can do this right for September.
Okay.
May I
Yes,
quickly, I just want
Dr.
to
Garner.
quickly comment. Yes, Ms. Smith brought up a comment about some board members having information that other board members don't have. And that's a challenge I think we all face. I mean, there's 12 of you, there's a handful of us. I recognize it's a challenge that we have to overcome, and this has been on very much it's been a very fast-moving conversation. With that being said, I will tell you that we're an honest group of people, and when a board member specifically asks us about something specific, we're going to talk about it, and we would do that for any any board member. I recognize that I've got to keep working on how do I make sure that other board members are apprised and know what's going on. So that I will take on and certainly will work on.
Okay, let's try to focus on guidance we want to give. I have a Mrs. Schultz to be followed by Mrs. Reed and Ms. Hines and Mr. Strauss. Mr. Schultz.
Well, and I'll address the issue of the fact that I'll put myself out there that I knew more about it because I've been addressing this with the previous administration, superintendent, deputy superintendent, since about 2 or 3 months after I got on the board. So I've years worth of emails with staff and the state over which, I've spent a lot of time delving in it. So if I happen to have addressed, some of the issues or spent time with advocates in the community, it's just because it's something that was on my particular radar. The hiring of teachers, I can't think of a better time having just passed this budget and knowing that we've had to create some positions potentially in this scenario for teachers when we have some teachers that are exiting, our FCPS family as a result of the budget, to have an opportunity to bring some teachers back into the fold. So I actually like that component of this. I don't think an answer from the board right now that it's too hard for us to address teacher workload when staffs come up with a way to do it and they've said we can do it in a meaningful way is kicking another can down the road for another year. That's just an untenable concept to me, especially when we didn't live up to our obligation of the full step, instead passed a delay. So I see us, killing 2 birds with 1 stone as coming a little bit more clean or a little bit more whole, and doing it without a delay. The snow days is a huge problem. We're going until June 25th, and nobody's happy about that. No one is. Teachers aren't happy. Principals aren't happy. Certainly, kids and families aren't happy. And this finally, once and for all, resolves us, having this unknown out there of how late are we going to possibly go. If we have another winter like we had, here we are right back in the same soup again, all starting next, January, rolling forward. And what to do and how many staff hours went into and how much, debate went into what do we do and how do we do it. So by fixing and affixing the end of the year, we've solved, a state issue of the King's Dominion law by saying, you know what, we're going to rebuild our calendar in such a way that we're going to create some surety for families and for teachers on when the end of the year is going to be, and that translates into all kinds of, I think, goodwill. Also, I think that this leads to the number of hours in school, because we'll be basically front loading our time with our kids in the classroom. Kids who are in whatever level class, but certainly the kids who are in AP and IB courses who are taking their exams, frankly, a bunch of them are already finished with their exams. It's that many more hours that they have in an academic environment before they take those exams. So it's sort of as if we've created a workaround the inability to start school when we see fit. Knowing that kids have already taken those AP and IB exams, well, if they had more hours in the classroom, since the start of the school year at this point, which they would under the scenario, that's good for all kids, and good for one kid, good for a lot, most kids, certainly. So leading is not always easy. There are sometimes difficult choices before us, and just because this is hard doesn't mean you don't do it. We just had Memorial Day. They did hard stuff too. This is hard, but tackling a 20-year-old, 30-year-old problem while there are other problems piling on top, like teacher workload, like consistency for, 20, 30 years ago, all the families weren't working families, with both parents working. This solves a lot of problems for families. You know, I've had teachers tell me that their families would save hundreds of dollars a month not having to cover daycare expenses on Mondays. So this not only helps parents, but it helps teachers who are parents who have young children. So, you know, there's a lot that this addresses and are the final nuances of working it out. And certainly engaging the teacher organizations is, to me, the paramount thing. On the, you know, you asked what would need to happen. To me, that would be the real issue, is making sure that they understand the nuances of this and that any refinements can be had to it. But I don't see how you can afford not to do it. The surety that it creates with holiday schedules and vacation schedules and end of year and snow days, and do we have enough money? I think it's probably would save money on things like snow removal and everything. I mean, there's so many things that it addresses, and will it address all of them perfectly the first time out? No. Pushing all of that to a same year where we're also going to attempt to look at start times, I think convolutes that so much that I think, you know, we're not going to be able to see the forest for the trees if you try to do all of it at one time. So if you do the change up front first, you know, have any nuanced fixes that need to happen as a result of that, then you're going in clean to any start time change discussions. So I don't see how we can't afford not to do it.
Mrs. Reed.
So I guess I was just following up. You had asked us to identify what our preference was. Did Mrs. Schultz identify what her preference was? Implement in 2014 is what I heard, right?
That sounds like she's going for September 2014.
Okay. I agree with everything that Mrs. Schultz just said. For me, just listening to the discussion, it's a question not if we'll do this, but when. I mean, even just the work that's been done so far, to me, it's very compelling. And as I said earlier, I think these fixes address so many challenges that we've been wrestling with that I think now the devil's in the details. But what I would suggest is aim towards a 2014 implementation, but schedule another work session and ask staff to come back with some targeted information for us, just so we can make the most informed decision. And that would include input from teachers and staff and the community, pros and cons, you know, of and implementation impacts of doing that this year versus next year. And then importantly, the cost issue, not just can we afford to do it, where would we take the money? And in my view, we don't want to just create yet another new initiative. From my perspective, I'd like to say, okay, we can do these things, but what are we taking off the plate? What are we stopping implementing? Because again, it's a zero sum, and in terms of dollars as well as staff time and energy, I think we really need to be focusing and doing less things and doing them well. So that would be my question there for the work session, is if staff could come back and say, well, here's where we think we could get the money to do this, and here's what we agree is probably of less importance and we could put on hold or sunset or whatever you want to call it, and not do that, so we could focus on these very important things. And last but not least, the issue of teacher workload. I know I've been talking about it for 5 years. I'm so tired of talking about it. This is the very first, no offense to anybody, extremely concrete and type of suggestion that I feel we've got to do it.
Ms. Hines next.
Yeah, thank you. I'm leaning toward trying to do it this fall as well, in 2014. It just sounds like the likely benefits are so great that we really should, you know, give it a try. The likely benefits are great. Our superintendent says it can be done. It'd be tough, but it can be done. And I think, you know, Dr. Garza, you've done such a good job this year of winning the confidence of people out in the field, teachers and principals, that I think even though this will be a challenge, you know, engaging all of them and getting something in line, I feel like you've laid the groundwork for that kind of conversation with them. So I feel confident that you and staff can come up with something that will work. It might not be perfect. I think we had to remember in the testimony of our teachers at budget time, a lot of them drifted into time, you know? They were talking about money, but they really drifted into, you know, how hard it is to be a teacher right now. And that has so much to do, we know, with time. And I feel like, you know, we didn't give them what we wanted to when it came to salary. You know, this is something, if we can push ourselves, it sounds like we can give them some real relief that is built right into the structure of the week. At least that's the hope, I guess. You know, I think I said to you, Dr. Garza, you're sort of building this plane as you fly it, right? That's probably how you feel. And I think that's how we all feel. But, you know, that's how teachers feel every day, right? And so to say that we don't have enough time to think about this, you know, kind of, I think might rub the teachers the wrong way because they don't have enough time to think about their job either, you know. So I would probably agree with Patty, Mrs. Reed, about maybe having another work session with an update on, you know, sort of where staff is after this, particularly on, you know, where the money's coming from and just how the teacher participation is going in the conversation. So, thanks.
Okay, I have a Mr. Strauss to be followed by Mr. Stork.
Okay, as I said before, I'd really like one more opportunity to discuss this, and particularly to talk with the curriculum-specific teachers. Because if we do this in September, there will be some things that, some long-time traditions in some schools that will end. And I would not want to roll something out and have unintended consequences that we hadn't thought about. There are some traditions, particularly in the arts, that have been going on for 20 or 30 years. And we need to make change with our eyes wide open so that we have parameters that are reasonable and that principals understand what they can and cannot do. Otherwise, we back into something and all of a sudden we find that something has occurred that we didn't think we were signing up for. So I think that's important. It seemed to be an indication of general music being a K through third grade curriculum. I think that would be a hard pill. So I would like another opportunity to talk in more detail about how this would work. Again, we've talked about pockets of excellence. We want to make sure that every school, if we do this, they could actually do it. I can think of some principals that have not, would be easy. I know others that would struggle mightily. And so we don't want to compound our questions about quality. So I would love an opportunity very quickly, because if we're going to do it, we push hard. And then the other piece is, again, in this community, if we roll this out in a certain way and we create instructional units for this it's really 2.5 hours of extra instructional time for children that we're going to be building in. Whatever you build in and whatever you hire in your particular school, if you decide 2 years from now we are going to hire more of another category of teacher, you have to figure out, then you are working against a gradient. So you have to think about not just the immediate move, but several moves ahead so that we eventually get to where we want to go with Portrait of a Graduate. If it's having all children speaking 2 languages, how do we get there if we know we can't hire all those teachers in one fell swoop for a variety of reasons? So we have to be careful what new traditions we invent. So I would be willing to meet. I think we'd have to do it very quickly to talk about this, because clearly fish are cut bait. And in terms of cost, this would have to come out of year-end money. And I don't think we would be able to take a cut. And I'll be very honest, I think it would simply come out of plans for salary for the next year. I don't know where else it would come out of, unless we don't get student enrollment growth or is some other way that we can save money. So I don't anticipate being able to come up with another cut of $7 to $8 million to pay for this between now and September.
Okay, I have a Mr. Stork next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support the objective, and I think this seems to offer a path. I can't kind of support it this moment, but I think some additional information. And then probably the biggest question for me is, and I think the value that I guess I've always had with these kinds of major changes, is the need to have some sort of community or public engagement. I think clearly administratively the process has been followed. I know that some of the teacher associations have been involved and like what they're seeing. But I think there are a lot of other people that need to at least feel like they're being consulted, engaged, if you will. I say that even recognizing that to do that, and given the other things that we're trying to do, makes that more difficult. But I don't think you do something this major without at least warming people up to the change that you're getting ready to do. And frankly, having a public engagement is a way of letting them know something big is getting ready to happen or potentially happening. And frankly, for me, it's one less reason for somebody to be able to say to me, I didn't know, and why didn't you communicate that better? So it's a way of kind of putting everybody on notice that this is something we're seriously considering, much like we did, frankly, with the starting high schools later. We, that motion that really put people on notice that we're moving this direction, and you need to be serious about consideration of it and identifying any pros and cons for yourself. So I think we need to move quickly. I'd like to at least consider it for 2014, but to be honest, only because, Dr. Garza, you think it's doable, because I have lots of questions and concerns of my own about that, and I'm not maybe maybe you're hopeful as well as or you just want to do something we know we need to do, and it's kind of like in some ways you just kind of move forward sometimes, but boy, that's big.
But I'm real about the challenges, and I think I've talked, I don't want to take more time, but I think we're all very well aware of the downsides to an aggressive communication and implementation. But it's one of those things that, the timeline works against us, and either we consider it now
Right.
and do something, or we have to wait another year. And it's just kind of some of those things that we do are like that. So I do think it's worthy of this. I think the conversation is very, very beneficial. So I appreciate that.
And I'm excited about having a little bit more discussion, and maybe as part of that, a little bit clearer, here's exactly what would need to be done with engagement. Obviously, you'd be working on both at the same time if we're going to have another work session. You have to assume that in that next work session that we move forward, so you have the pieces in place to do the engagement. I don't think you can, not that you're pulling the trigger on it, but that you are, I think if you're truly looking at engaging people, I would say sometime in June. I mean, going past that is like, how can you do that? I don't see how you could do that. So it's a parallel track that you're going to need to follow, and I'm sure my chairman has a lot of time to spend on that and help make that possible. So thank you.
I've been looking at the calendar for the last 15 minutes to see. All right. Thank you, Mr. Storr. Are you done for the time being? Are you done? Okay, I have Ms. Evans next.
Yes, thank you. It's absolutely critical that we do something for the teacher workload and the teacher time issue. That's something that we've talked about and we've tried to grapple with and not come up with the concrete plan that we need. So I appreciate the work that went into this. I think that you've done a terrific job of pulling together some excellent proposals for us to take a look at. It is a lot to absorb. I don't know about anybody else, but I had not seen this proposal until it was posted at 2:08 today. And that's a lot for us. As Mr. Paris was going through the details of this, I realized there's just a lot of pieces to this. So I, for one, feel that we do need to have more discussion and more time for us to think about this and understand the details of it, go and read some of the details for ourselves. And one of the reasons I ask so few questions is because I have so many, if that makes any sense. And while I think this clearly is the way we need to be going, I think we all have questions about the number, a lot of the details. So, and I have to admit to a certain frustration. We've felt that we could not. We've been working on the healthier schedules for our high school students for 2 years now. 2 years, and decided that we just plain couldn't do it this fall. And yet here we are, looking at a new proposal, and we're looking at somehow we can do this fall. So I have to admit that gives me frustration, and I personally would want some assurances that doing this would not impede that plan, because we do need to get the healthier schedule for our high school students, and I would want some assurances that this would not in some way detract from that effort.
That's interesting. I don't know that I could let that comment go without commenting on it. I see these two issues as very, very different. Both are very important, but I think different in that I don't know that we have. I think changing the start times affects a lot of people's lives, and so I think we're doing it in the right way. This one's a little different in that we do recognize there's this need we have, right, with workload and the challenges that our teachers are facing. We've heard it time and time again. I think we have to wrestle with, do we do this quickly and get it done? I think you have to separate these two and say, we made that decision that was right for that. Now we need to make the decision that is right for this one. And I think that's still to be considered. I don't think it's one's more valuable than the other. I think they're both valuable. It's just responding to different needs. And so I know that I'm not contradicting you. I'm just trying to reframe. Is that fair?
It is fair, yeah, and I appreciate you saying that. And I guess, of course, we do have to take care of the teacher workload, and of course, the early close Mondays have had other ramifications too. So it's time we address that. So it's not to detract from this issue, but we have that other problem, and I just want to make sure that stays on track too. So I guess my vote, if we're...
Your guidance.
My guidance, is that we do need more time to absorb, at least I do. Those of you who are very quick probably have absorbed it immediately, but I would like to think about any other issues that we may have and have it a little bit more, and I frankly want to have some more conversations with some folks about some of the details too, and then come back and talk about it and make a decision. I'm certainly not prepared to make a decision for this fall right this minute.
We're not making decision tonight.
Good.
Okay, I know that Mrs. Smith wanted to go back. Is that, no, okay, I'll take you off the list. Okay, anybody else? All right, then I'll be the last one. And I'll be the last one. I know, Mrs. Strauss has served on the board many years, longer than I have. But in my 15 years of service on the board, I have never been more excited than with this recommendation. With one exception, though, with a full day K. I mean, that was the best thing that has happened in my career as a board member. This will be the second best.
And hiring Dr. Garza, too. I'm going to just throw that out there.
Am I in the top three? That's good.
So when I found out that the staff has been working on this for many months, that I suggest to the Dr. Garza that we bring this to the board's attention as soon as possible, so that board can weigh in on this work, before we invest more time and efforts going this direction. Again, I am very excited about this. I know that no matter what you do, whether this September or next September, there will be no perfect rollout. With that in mind, I would prefer to do this in this September than next September. I know that most of the board members, many of board members, have not received any information about recommendation until earlier this afternoon. With that in mind, also, there are 4 board members, 4 of my colleagues, not here. 2 board members, commented a bit earlier, but they had to leave for other engagement. So it is my desire, with your consent, with your agreement, to schedule another work session. But we did this discuss in the chairman's meeting, and superintendent feels that if the board wants to do this from September this year, we have to make definite decisions by the end of June. Otherwise, September 2014 is not going to happen. So with that in mind, I need to schedule a work session sometime in June. Meanwhile, I suggest that all board members send in all the questions you have. I'm not saying that STEP will be able to answer every question you will be asking, but STEP will do their best to respond to your questions in writing and also at the next work session as well. And if you have other suggestions, please send them in and copying all board members. I do not encourage online discussion. Just send in copy to all other board members, to letting board members know that what sort of questions you have, what sort of suggestions you are making, but do not engage in online discussion. And I know, Dr. Gaza, you wanted to speak on this. I am also just thought occurred to me as a part of engaging the public. This is it's a huge, this is a huge topic and issue for the community. I believe that this will be, my gut feeling is this will be very, very well received by the community in general. If I have to go out and poll, parents and members in the community, more than 90% will support this at a heartbeat. So what about scheduling a public hearing as well before the end of June?
I don't think it's necessary. Community's going to love it.
I'm just asking, I want to see the purse of the board on that. I will be scheduling a work session and give a public an opportunity to speak to us in one setting.
You said a public hearing, not an engagement. Public hearing means one way, they get up, they speak 3 minutes, they sit down, so on. And you talked about one instead of being, engagement to me would be more, and I'm just throwing out the concept, having at least a couple, so you have kind of one in the more the northern part, one more the southern part, at least give people not as far to drive if they want to participate or want to be involved. I would ideally like to have 3, north, middle, south, but I realize the time is short, but I want to at least throw that out.
Time is very short.
Being more of an ideal of what we should aspire to, even if it may not be possible.
Okay, I want that to be, I want to get some feedback from board members. I want to schedule a work session in June. It could be, we could, one option could be just tack onto the existing work session on June 16th, yes.
Dan has to leave to go to another commitment, because I know that we're supposed to wrap up before now, but I just want to compliment, Mr.
Absolutely.
Moon, because
Absolutely.
we put a lot on this guy's shoulders over these last 6 months. This, among many other major pieces of work, SR&R, for an example, our restructuring, just a multitude of different things. He's going to be greatly missed. I hate that he's going to leave at the end of this month, but I have to compliment him on pulling this together and working as hard as he has with so many people. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
So, I apologize for the interruption.
And just as you walk out, Dan, for your patience.
Okay, so I will schedule a work session on either June 16th. June 16th is our regular work session day, which may already go to like a 6 o'clock, or looking at other, I'm going to check with your calendar through your EAA. I'm also looking at possibly on June 9th. June 9th. Okay? Because after that, we go into graduations. And then...
There's a community meeting that night.
I understand that. I mean, I've been checking the calendar. Almost every evening we have something. And for the work session, I just want to have, how we want to engage public if we want to do it. I mean, that's the question to you from me as the chair. Mrs. Strauss.
I think on this issue, we know parents would love to have full-day Mondays. I mean, most of our parents are working, and it's real tough. So I am not sure that this is a community engagement issue. We need to let people know we're talking about it. I think that from listening to my colleagues, the questions are more feasibility by September, and that we are comfortable that we can roll this out in a quality way. And Dr.
It's more of
Garza says
engaging
yes.
maybe teachers and principals, whether this can be done.
Yes, because every parent that I've ever talked to would say, well, please can we get rid of Monday early
Sure,
closing?
sure.
And we know the workload issue for teachers. So we've heard that. This is why this is being so strongly recommended by Dr. Garza, because it solves a lot of other problems.
Thank
So
you. Will that be
that's-
okay, Mr. Stork?
I absolutely expected that teachers and staff and community, that's my hope, was that that would be an open door for anybody who really had any particular concerns, burning concerns, or positive or negative.
Okay. Okay? A hearing or how to engage with staff. I mean, at this point, I think there's been, go ahead, Ms. Evans.
No, I think right now we're talking about just another opportunity for the board to visit about it.
So work
for
session
us
we
to-
will do, work session we will do. In subcommittee, there is no traction for public hearing, but just let me know what you think.
And we can also contemplate how we might provide some opportunity for engagement when we have that next conversation. But we certainly are open to your ideas. And then finally, Mr. Moon, if you don't mind, Mona asked for me to, if board members are around, if you don't have another obligation, they'd love to invite you to come down for a few minutes at
There's a
the
meeting,
Fairfax
general meeting
County
for Fairfax County Council PTA
Council
right now.
PTA, just 5 minutes, if you want to. Mhm.
They're
To
starting at
start
7
in the-
o'clock,
in the
7 o'clock.
cafe.
So I think with that, I will schedule another work session at the next step on either, yes, Mrs. Strauss? Mrs. Okay, we're not discussing any education issue. We're not discussing any education issue. So if they are discussing issue, we walk out. Okay, we walk out if they're discussing education issue. All right? With that, I don't complain if I put it on June 9th or extend the work session on June 16th. Okay. Okay, all right, I'll get back to you because this work must be done. Okay, okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.